Yep, you read the title right. In this video, I will be ranking every single episode from the Brenner era, from season 17 to season 21. That's 124 episodes. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Brenner era, and I have a ton of nostalgia for it. It was fun rewatching these episodes for the video, and seeing how the series changed and evolved as the years went on. Each season has its gems, but also its stinkers. It was hard ranking all of the episodes, but even harder to complete this entire video. But I've finally done it. These episodes are ranked by how much I like them, based on how memorable they are, interesting story concepts, etc. I will only be including the episodes from seasons 17 to 21, so no specials. I also won't be including the bubbling boilers thing, because it's not part of any particular season, rather it's a separate thing entirely. I'll also assume that you are at least vaguely familiar with these episodes, as I don't want to waste time explaining the plot of each episode. This video will be long enough as it is after all. Lastly, please note that this is my own personal list consisting of my opinions, so don't take this list personally. With that out of the way, let's get started, shall we? 124. Henry Spots Trouble. This is what I consider to be the worst episode of the Brenner era. It seems that it's a perfect mashup of everything that I hate about the Brenner era. Firstly, Henry being scared is the main plot of the episode, and he is scared of chickenpox of all things. The episode follows a three-strike formula style since Henry meets Thomas, Paxton, and Gordon before he is explained that engines can't get chickenpox after all. Not to mention that the way all three engines somehow get spots on their face feels rather unnatural, and it's a big coincidence that all three get spots and that Henry passes by all of them. It just seems like plot convenience to me. Henry screams and rushes all the way down the main line for pretty much the entire episode, with disregard for his jobs or railway safety. And to put the cherry on this mess of a cake, the episode even pokes fun at Sir Topham Hatt by having him rip his pants and expose his underwear. There's very little good about the episode besides the animation and the music, which are at least good in every Brenner era episode. Henry Spots Trouble is one of the very few episodes on this list that I would consider to be outright terrible. 123. Signals Crossed. Say hello to the worst character mess-up of the era, Toby the Coward. In this episode, Toby is frightened of Knapford Junction due to all the chaos, which admittedly isn't too bad of a concept for an episode, but it is ruined because Toby doesn't know his signals. He doesn't even know which signal means go and which one is stop, which is blatantly unrealistic because that's like one of the basic things of railway practice, and Toby's been on the railway for decades. It's even mentioned in another episode that he's one of the oldest engines on the island, so why he wouldn't know his signals by now is beyond me. Unlike Henry Spots Trouble, there are some positives to this episode, albeit very few. Knapford Junction makes its first appearance, and I think it does a good job of making the station look more lively. Henrietta is also reintroduced this episode, and she's given a face. That is a great decision if you ask me, because she was hardly a character before since she didn't have a face, and sometime around like season 3 or 4, the TV series established the unspoken rule that only vehicles with faces can speak, which Henrietta wasn't. Now we can finally get to see her relationship with Toby at a much deeper level. Even when she has to deal with Toby's ruined character, she's quite a good character in my opinion. That's more of a praise to Henrietta herself rather than this episode in particular though, and I'm only mentioning it because she's technically reintroduced here. But the most serious crime of this episode is that Ferdinand appears in it, and that absolutely ruins the entire episode, 0 out of 10. Now in all seriousness, although there are a couple of positives to this episode, it is seriously held down by Toby's unnatural incompetence with signals. 122. Emily in the Middle. While I'm on the topic of character flanderizations, Donald and Douglas are not portrayed well at all in this episode. This seems to be something that bothers me more than most people, so let me explain. Donald and Douglas are not like other twins. They had to cooperate to get to Sodor at all, and to make sure that they stayed on it. After all, Douglas was not meant to be on the island originally, so Donald was taking a huge risk by bringing him there. The CGI counterparts bicker endlessly to the point where in both of their lead roles, it's really their only defining trait besides being associated with snow. I just can't picture the CGI versions of Donald and Douglas escaping to Sodor together. What would probably happen is that Donald would just ditch Douglas on the way due to a stupid argument or something. The arguing is something that I don't like, period, not just in the CGI series. I didn't like it in Twin Trouble, I didn't like it in Love Me Tender, and I don't like it here. What I'm trying to say by all this is, I can't enjoy Emily in the Middle because of Donald and Douglas's portrayals. Not only are they inaccurate in my opinion, it's just really cliche at this point. We've had like 3 episodes by now where they argue. It's getting tired. It's not original. At least in Love Me Tender, they had some restraint with the arguing, but here it feels like they argue as soon as they see the opportunity. Emily adds little to the episode other than fueling the fire that is Donald and Douglas's bickering. Not to mention, this is perhaps the episode with the most egregious bouncing in season 21. It makes the argy-bargy between the twins look even more childish. I was actually surprised to find after rewatching the episode that it was even worse than I remembered. It's such a shame because an episode with Emily, Donald, and Douglas has really huge potential, but it just feels like it was squandered. 121. Steamy Stafford. Steamy Stafford suffers from having a silly concept, one that reminds me more of the Miller era than anything. Seriously, an engine making chuffing and puffing noises to pretend they're a steam engine? That's like one of the silliest ideas I've ever heard. The fact that the children wave at Stafford when he makes those noises, despite the fact that they sound nothing like a real steam engine's noises, is just baffling to me. If I was on that bridge watching Stafford and hearing his imitations, I wouldn't be waving at him, I would be wondering what on earth is wrong with him. Besides that, there isn't anything majorly wrong with the episode, but it is fairly slow and makes heavy use of the narrator, but then again, so do many of the other Season 17 episodes. It's really just a story that I really dislike, but unfortunately, the story is the most important part of an episode, in my opinion. 120. Flatbeds of Fear. I'll be honest, with a few exceptions, I'm not really a fan of the CGI spooky-themed episodes. They all blend together for me and feel the same. An engine makes up a story or mistakes something for a ghost, and then they and some other engines get spooked by it and later end up finding out the truth. There's little variety. In comparison, the classic series had a variety of spooky episodes, some following this format such as Ghost Train, and others providing a spin on it, such as Duncan Gets Spooked. They each have different atmospheres and highlight the capabilities of the models, such as the Dragon in Thomas, Percy and the Dragon, or the scenery in Fog and Haunted Henry, whereas most CGI episodes have pretty much the same atmosphere. And Flatbeds of Fear is a perfect example of that. It follows the textbook formula of character, in this case Salty, makes up a story, other engines, Thomas, Henry, and Emily, believe it, and make fools of themselves before Salty tells them that the story is made up. Not to mention, Flatbeds of Fear has like the lamest ghost story ever. Like seriously, who would be scared of flatbeds? They don't even have faces. To make matters worse, Henry's worrisome personality found a resurgence in this episode. I thought Henry was treated quite well in Season 17, pretty close to his classic series persona, but Season 18 marked the beginning of the end for him. All in all, not a fan. 119. Rocky Rescue. Credit where credit is due, it's cool that the team attempted an episode starring Rocky, a character who does little otherwise in the Brenner era. The problem is that the rest of the Sodor Search and Rescue team act like total idiots. They act like they've never rescued someone before with how competitive and incompetent they are. And that can't be true because later in the season they get an award for 1,000 rescues. How could they have had so many rescues and yet they act like this? Plus, they never were this competitive in other episodes, they've always been sensible and reasonable, at least in the Brenner era. So twisting their personalities in order to make this episode work just doesn't cut it for me. Granted, they do learn the importance of teamwork later, but it's a lesson that should have already been learned long ago. I do, however, like the recurring gag of Captain charging into the water when he isn't actually needed, and the payoff at the end when he finally has the chance to participate in an emergency. That was cool. 118. Scruffs Makeover. We're out of the bad episodes and into the whatever ones. Scruffs Makeover is a fine episode on its own, but it's incredibly unnoteworthy in my opinion. In this episode, Scruff gets cleaned for once, and although he doesn't like it at first, he becomes so fond of his new coat that he doesn't want to get dirty. But he soon reverts to his old ways after getting accidentally covered in garbage waste. My problem with this episode is Scruff, who's just a nothing character for me. I appreciate the fact that they tried to experiment with the Miller-era characters in Season 17, but unfortunately they mostly suffer from the same issue, and that is that these episodes don't really expand on these characters in any meaningful way, but either just use the one trait that they have, like in Steamy Stafford, which is based on Stafford being battery-powered rather than powered by steam, or they try to subvert that trait, like in this episode. Either way, it's just a one-trick pony. It's no wonder that Scruff, along with many of the other characters like Stafford or Charlie, were hardly used beyond this season. 117. Engine of the Future. Well, we finally have a Season 20 episode. Generally, I'm a huge fan of Season 20, but even it has its mediocre episodes, and this is one of them. Engine of the Future features a new character, Hugo, who is the token new character of the season. He only appears in 2 episodes, both of which are fairly low on this list because Hugo himself is not a very interesting character in my opinion. He has a cool design, sure, but what personality does he have? I mean, he wants to fly, I guess, he's helpful, he has a somewhat dangerous propeller, but none of these make for really exciting or original episodes. Engine of the Future also suffers from the tired trope of engines worry that they will be replaced because of X character. In this case, they worry that Hugo will replace them. These never work with me because you always know how the episodes will end. Of course, a Top Hat would never replace his engines. Plus, I think the new character should be challenged by their own flaws, rather than someone else's. What I mean by that is that by making someone else mean towards a new character, it won't really make the new character interesting, it won't give them personality. A prime example of that is Emily's new coaches, where Thomas thinks Emily stole his coaches when she took them accidentally. The episode doesn't really do a good job of showing any sort of unique character because she doesn't really portray any flaws. Thomas is the flawed character in that episode. And Engine of the Future is the same case. I will say though, I did like how Hugo was hyped up at the beginning of the episode. It was very exciting. Unfortunately, he just didn't live up to the hype. 116. Luke's New Friend. I'm not the biggest fan of animal-centered episodes. They can be pulled off well, like with Henry and the Elephant, but often I find that they aren't done super well. Luke's New Friend fails because it is rather slow-paced and the plot takes a while to get to where it needs to be. It also follows somewhat of a 3-strike formula since the deer jumps in and out of Luke's cap several times before finally being taken to Ulfstead Castle. The episode is pretty repetitive and slow-paced as a result. I will say it's nice to see the Skarloey Railway cast in an episode, since there aren't really many Skarloey episodes in this era of Thomas, but I think that the other Luke episode this season is much better. 115. Away from the Sea. You know, there are only 2 Salty-centered episodes on this list, and I don't think either of them are particularly great. Both deal with Salty being worried about something and trying to do something to prevent it. In this episode, Salty worries that Sir Topham Hatt will send him to the quarry if he doesn't work hard enough, so he avoids going to the diesel works, and when he finally does, he rushes out as soon as he can. Ultimately, I think these Salty episodes don't work for me because Salty is a cheerful character, as we can see in the multitude of his secondary roles. Now granted, he did worry about being stuck in the quarry in Salty's secret, which they actually do reference here, but I think Sir Topham Hatt would know that Salty's more suitable for the docks, and Salty would know that he wouldn't be replaced. It's the whole being replaced plot cliche that I don't really like about the episode either. Lastly, there's the new character, Porter. The reason that I haven't mentioned him at all is that he doesn't really do anything besides being a threat to Salty, but afterwards when Sir Topham Hatt tells the 2 of them that they will both work at the docks, Porter becomes kind of a generic nice guy without standing out much other than his 3 domes. He's a perfectly okay character. He has some good secondary roles like in the Smelly Kipper or Gone Fishing, but he doesn't have any leading episodes besides this one, showing that he's pretty weak and kind of bland as a protagonist. 114. The Phantom Express. Many issues that I have with Flatbeds of Fear also apply here, specifically with regards to the plot of the episode. The ghost story of a phantom engine is better than that of some flatbeds, but that doesn't really help the episode too much. The characters are also better here, and aren't severely out of character like Henry in Flatbeds of Fear. In fact, I like Steven in this episode. He has some funny lines and in general he has good dialogue. The crash at the end with Percy and Steven falling down the drawbridge is also pretty fun. Unfortunately, the episode can't be placed any higher because of the tired tropes that most ghost stories of this era seem to follow, of an engine making up a story and subsequently getting their comeuppance, which happens with James in this episode. It's a fine episode, I guess, but I wouldn't really rewatch it. 113. Helping Hiro. I have several issues with this episode, the main one being Thomas. His portrayal here feels off to me, especially at the beginning where he's so eager to ask Hiro a bunch of questions and looks up to him like an idol. I don't think of Thomas when I think of that persona, I think more of someone like Philip. I understand that Thomas has to be the lead here because of the history that he and Hiro had in Hero of the Rails, but he could have at least been better written, I think. Another gripe of mine is, why did Thomas go to Hiro's hideout to look for spare parts? When Hiro was abandoned, he didn't have spare parts with him. In Hero of the Rails, Thomas had to deliver parts to him from the steamworks. So what makes him think that the hideout will have spare parts now? I just don't understand that lapse in logic. Besides that, we have a fairly mediocre episode with a decently cool crash and a nicely animated forest setting, but that's about it. 112. Not Now, Charlie. Remember that rant I had when discussing Scruffs Makeover about Miller-era characters being one-dimensional? Well, that also applies here. Charlie is incredibly one-note, not to mention his jokes are painfully unfunny. The episode also follows a 3-strike formula. Several season 17 episodes do, but I think it's particularly noticeable in this one because of the simple plot. It is fun that the engines don't take Charlie seriously though, considering that he constantly tells jokes too much for his own good. It's a shame that he didn't really develop all that much after this episode, since he hardly appears afterwards. And I don't have much else to say. This is a fine episode, but a pretty forgettable one in my opinion. 111. The Beast of Sodor. And here comes another Scaredy Henry episode. Unlike Henry Spots Trouble though, there are some things that I like about this one. It's cool to have Spencer here, and Dowager Hat is by far my favorite part about the episode. She had some nice comedy with the abominable snowman bit. But what I don't like though is the way the episode pokes fun at Sir Topham Hatt. I don't like when Sir Topham Hatt is poked fun at too much. It's fine once in a while, but not to this degree. He's supposed to be a figure of authority, not a bumbling buffoon, which is what he is in this episode. He is chased by a bull covered in his snow, and scolded by his mother, not to mention the number of times he just slips in the snow. It sounds what would be an otherwise okay episode. I mentioned Scaredy Henry earlier. Yeah, he's scared in this episode of an abominable snowman of all things, but I don't think his character is as bad as in Henry Spots Trouble. At least he has somewhat of a redemption in this episode. Overall, this episode pushes the comedic edge too much. Sometimes it can be funny, but other times the comedy just doesn't land at all. 110. Timothy and the Rainbow Truck. My issue with the Timothy episodes is that they all follow the same kind of formula. All three of them have the plot of Bill and Ben making fun of Timothy and playing tricks on him, and eventually getting their comeuppance. This episode does exactly that. Bill and Ben play a prank on Timothy by telling him to find a rainbow truck, which is supposedly an important one. Now, I know Timothy is a gullible character, but I'm surprised how long it took him to realize that the twins had played a trick on him. He was suspicious at the beginning too, but just thought nothing of it afterwards, which I find hard to believe. There is a payoff, but to be honest, I didn't think it was particularly satisfying. The plot in general is somewhat of an odd one, which is why I placed it below the other Timothy episodes. Like, searching for a rainbow-colored truck doesn't seem like the most exciting idea for a prank. Also, this is a small thing, but when describing the truck, why did Timothy have to name all the colors?
But it's red and orange, yellow and green, blue and indigo and violet, just like you said.
He could have just saved time by saying it was rainbow-colored. 109. Too many fire engines. It's nice to have an episode about Belle and Flynn, and it's even somewhat meta by questioning why there are 2 fire engines in Sodor. Kind of a nice jab at the Miller era. But the reasoning for that seems a bit cheap though. At the end, Flynn has to fight a fire at Brendan Docks while Belle has to stay at Ulfstead Castle to supervise the fireworks. Now, that's fine and all, but what if there were 2 fireworks shows on the island? By that logic, they'd need like 3 fire engines. 2 for the fireworks and 1 in case there was a fire. I mean, just seems very convenient reasoning. But perhaps I'm overthinking it though. Another reason I put this episode fairly low is because I find Belle and Flynn to be rather boring characters. They're not really particularly interesting to watch. Not to mention, the episode suffers from being rather slow-paced with heavy use of narration, which to be fair is fairly commonplace in Season 17. That's why many of these episodes are placed below average. I will say though, my favorite part of the episode was the inspector who just kept saying, I don't know why, but it cracked me up, and I was glad when he returned and stuck in gear. 108. Saving Time. Samson is not a very popular character. Now, I like him better than probably most people do, but Saving Time is still fairly low on this list. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, but there's nothing much that I like about it either. Paxton is funny as usual, and Samson's antics are entertaining, albeit pretty stupid. It's just that I tend to forget this episode exists. Also, Samson doesn't even learn his lesson in the end, like he takes 1 truck at a time. I know his whole point is that he's just stupid and makes mistakes, but how stupid can he get? I will say though, I like Sir Handel and Peter Sam's appearances in this, and their teasing towards Samson. It's probably their best role in the whole CGI series, considering how underutilized they were. 107. The Big Freeze. Now this episode has a great concept. An episode about the steam engines all being trapped due to a coal shortage is a great idea for an episode, and it gives a chance for the diesels to shine. Not to mention that on the DVD where it was packaged with the other season 21 Christmas episodes, it mentioned that Diesel would have a chance to prove himself a hero. I was thrilled by that when I first found out about it, since it seemed that it would be building on his character development from Springtime for Diesel. Unfortunately, this episode disappoints with a basic plot, and it doesn't explore the Diesel side of things as much as it could have, in favor of a more Thomas-centered plot. Now, it is cool to see the Diesel cavalcade on its way to save the day, but they could have done so much more with that. And as for Diesel, he doesn't really feel like a hero in this. Like, sure, he delivers the code of the steam engines, but it seems like he does it more out of obligation than anything. Like he's still an annoying jerk to Thomas. Perhaps if we'd seen a subplot where he struggles through a storm to get to the mainland to get the coal or something like that, his title of a hero would be more deserved. In general, I would have liked to see more about the Diesel and how they handle trains that the steam engines normally do. For example, how they handled the express or the mail train. The Big Freeze had such potential, but didn't live up to it in my eyes. 106. No Steam Without Coal. Another Timothy episode. This one I put above Timothy and the Rainbow Truck because I think its plot is more solid. Bill and Ben tease Timothy about being the odd one out since he runs on oil rather than coal. It's nice that they utilize the fact that Timothy runs on oil in an episode. It makes him stand out as a character a bit more. What I don't like is how teasy Bill and Ben are. I like them in CGI fine, but not in relation to Timothy. Timothy's basically a punching bag for Bill and Ben, which I think paints them as bullies rather than pranksters, which is more what they were like in the model series. And perhaps I'm soured from the Donald and Douglas episode, but I just don't think it's very fun seeing Bill and Ben argue. Yeah, it's more in character for them than for Donald and Douglas, but that doesn't mean it's always fun. There's a reason Buffer Bother has such a mixed reception. Despite my complaints, I think No Steam Without Coal is an alright episode, and fleshes out Timothy as a character more than Timothy and the Rainbow Truck. 105. No Help at All. This episode is very similar to the previous Timothy episode, even down to the title. The two are very similar in plot. Bill and Ben make fun of Timothy, they lose track of work at the clay pits, and Timothy has to sort things right. That's basically what happens here. There are a few reasons I put this above No Steam Without Coal though. Firstly, I like the continuity with Salty All at Sea. It feels like this episode's existence is more justified because of that. I also like the Down by the Dock song that plays during the episode, since this is the only time, at least prior to All Engines Go, that a song is played during an episode. And lastly, I like the inclusion of the Dockside crew in the episode, and we get to see Timothy's relationship with them, albeit not for too long. Although I have praised this episode a lot, its plot is still the same formulaically as the other Timothy episodes, which is why it barely edges them out. 104. Stuck in Gear. Harvey's main trait in the CGI series is being self-conscious, and nowhere is it more prevalent than in this episode. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I quite liked Gone Fishing even though it played with the same personality trait, but this episode cranks it up to 11. Harvey is so self-conscious here that he will do anything to avoid getting attention, which just wasn't the case in Gone Fishing. When he gets a branch stuck in his hook, Harvey intentionally avoids the docks and tries to hide in a tunnel. Like, what does he think that's going to accomplish? He'll have to get the branch out eventually anyway. Why doesn't his driver try to get it out? He literally runs himself off the rails in an effort to get inside that tunnel. It's just silly. Harvey may be a self-conscious character, but he isn't a stupid one. This episode would be fine otherwise, but it was dragged out by Harvey's absurd antics. 103. Diesel and the Ducklings. This is a very unpopular episode amongst the fandom. I don't hate it like most people do. In fact, there are a couple of things I like about the episode. For one, this is really the only episode in the Brenner era where Airy and Bert have a major role. It's a shame that they are portrayed as generic sidekicks to Diesel, instead of featuring them in the Ironworks or something, but at least they're here at all. This episode also marks the introduction of Diesel's theme that would be used in the following seasons, and I quite like it. What I don't like though is how Diesel is portrayed. He's shown as trying to be a tough guy, but as a soft side towards Ducklings. And I'm sorry, but Diesel just doesn't seem like that kind of character to me, and Airy and Bert especially don't. That scene at the end where all three of them watch the ducklings and see how cute they are just made me cringe.
Oh, Cooey!
Bruh.
Nice, Stucky!
Bruh.
Look at their tiny little wings!
Bruh.
And the way they whittle waddle!
Bruh.
Oh, little diddums!
Bruh.
Besides that, Diesel and the Ducklings is a passable episode, but Diesel, Airy, and Bert could have definitely been written better. Also, can I mention how much of a missed opportunity it was to not have Duck in this episode? I mean, come on, the whole episode is about ducks. It was right there. 102. New Crane on the Dock. This episode is part 2 of a two-parter introducing Carly to Brendam Docks. To be honest, I'm not a big fan of Carly because she's very hyperactive and her color scheme contrasts the greens, blues, and grays of the dockside. The episode itself isn't super original and has a rather heavy-handed plot about working together, a moral we've seen in the franchise many times before. I feel like the two Cranky Carly episodes could have been mashed together instead of stretched out like this, as each episode is a light plot and feels somewhat stretched, especially with this episode. The rivalry between Cranky and Carly is alright, but the whole sequence is too actiony and wacky for my liking. The thing that everyone talks about with this episode, of course, is Big Mickey's return. He has a pretty cool intro at the end of the episode, but Big Mickey himself hardly does anything, and now we have 3 talking cranes on the dock. A little excessive if you ask me. 101. Long Lost Friend. I'm generally a big fan of the Gator episodes, but this one is the exception. The plot of Long Lost Friend is that Gator returns to Sodor, and he and Percy try to find each other, but can't. Eventually, they think that perhaps the other one just doesn't want to see them, and so Thomas has to rejoice them. My criticism here is that Percy and Gator come to the conclusion that they don't want to meet each other, and what, because they haven't seen each other in like 2 hours? Seems like a rather rash conclusion to come to. The episode is also rather repetitive, hearkening to the dark ages of the 3-strike formula. But despite that, the ending of this episode is pretty strong, and it's great to see Gator for one last time. 100. A Shed for Edward. It's only fitting that the 100th place in this list goes to A Shed for Edward, undoubtedly the most controversial Brenner era episode. On its own, the episode is fine. Not my favorite Edward episode, certainly, but his role here is actually somewhat different from his usual episodes. He doesn't have to prove his worth to the other engines and isn't a mentor this time around. Instead, the plot is about him finding a shed to sleep in, and struggling to criticize Philip's constant chatter for fear of hurting his feelings, a role that we haven't really seen Edward in before. It would be a fine episode, if not for the ending, because of course this is the episode where Edward is written off the main cast. Dare I say it, the ending might just be the worst scene in the entire Brenner era. I almost wouldn't have a problem with it if it was done well, but it is so rushed it practically ruins the entire episode. So you're telling me that Edward decides on a whim to suddenly sleep with Philip forever. He just doesn't take any time to think about that decision. And we don't even see him develop a meaningful bond with Philip. No, he just decides on a whim to basically leave his lifelong friends for Philip of all characters. Not to mention, after he leaves, Emily says,
I wonder who will be joining us here at Tidmouth Sheds.
I'm sorry, but just because Edward just left doesn't mean that someone has to replace him. But that's Mattel logic, I guess. Doesn't help that the last line is,
But that's a story for another day.
Kinda makes sense when you consider the Rebecca episodes were originally meant to be in this season, but A Shed for Edward is the last episode in the Brenner era in production order. The last thing that I want to hear when watching the last episode of the Brenner era is some foreshadowing nonsense for the next season. Phew, well that was enough of that rant. Let's move on to the double digits. 99. Kevin's Cranky Friend. This episode is what many would consider to be the first episode of the Brenner era, as it was the first episode released on TV in the UK. It's a fun episode, but suffers from many issues that Season 17 in general is known for, such as the slow pacing, overuse of the narration, and the 3-strike formula. However, I do like the relationship between Cranky and Kevin in this episode. They're an unconventional duo, but Cranky's cynicism matches surprisingly well with Kevin's enthusiasm. I don't have much to say other than that. Kevin's Cranky Friend is a fine episode, but nothing special in my opinion. 98. The Afternoon Tea Express. This episode is just forgettable. I'm struggling to think of things to say about it. The episode's about Spencer complaining about Steven being slow, and so Steven tries to get a push from the other engines to make him faster. Unfortunately, one time it goes too far, and Steven ends up crashing into some buffers and spilling jam all over the Earl and Sir Topham Hatt and his wife. The moral is fairly similar to Steamy Stafford, where the character learns that it's just best to be themselves. Rather tired moral in my opinion. I wouldn't say The Afternoon Tea Express is a bad episode, but I would say it's a forgettable one, perhaps the most forgettable of the lot. 97. Philip's Number. I initially thought that I would be putting this episode much lower in the list, but it's actually better than I remembered. Philip's Number has a rather simple plot, but it just runs with it. Philip is in avid search of why he's numbered 68 and scours the whole island to find out. It's a simple plot and feels somewhat drawn out, but the episode is interesting enough with its gags, and the ending where Philip prevents Gordon from an accident is quite climactic. Unfortunately, there are a few other issues with the episode besides the main plot, mainly the fantasy sequences. There are a fair few in this episode, such as when Philip imagines seeing 67 other Philips, or when the troublesome trucks shape into the number 68. Like seriously, this episode feels like a beta test for what would become the fantasy sequences in Big World Big Adventures. It wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but the fantasy scenes aren't differentiated from the real scenes in any particular way, not even with a cloud border or anything, which just makes them even more bizarre. The plot also feels rather disjointed, jumping from place to place, and only connected by the mere number 68. And the very end of the episode is also quite disappointing, since we don't even get to find out why Philip was numbered 68 in the first place. Now I get that he was actually numbered 68 because he was the 68th engine on the Northwestern Railway when they made it, but it would have been nice to have it explained in-universe. Like I bet some kids asked their parents once the episode ended, but why does Philip have the number 68? 96. Salty All at Sea. And here's the other of the two salty episodes. My gripes with this one are fairly similar to Away from the Sea, but credit where credit is due. This episode is more interesting than that one, in my opinion. I like the subversion of Salty's character. Despite loving the docks, he's actually quite afraid of sailing at sea. However, the way he just runs away from the docks and tries to hide from everyone seems like silly behavior, kinda like Harvey in Stuck in Gear. I don't think Salty would be that desperate over his fear of the sea. If anything, I'd imagine he would face his fears rather than hide from them. Also, the fact that Salty is scared over his own tales seems rather silly, but other than that, Salty All at Sea is an all-around okay episode. 95. Duck in the Water. Now I like myself a good duck episode, but Duck in the Water is just an okay duck episode. To be honest, it feels like they came up with the title first, and then the story was an afterthought. As if someone said, wouldn't it be funny if we named an episode Duck in the Water because, he's named Duck? And then they were like, oh yeah, but we still need to come up with a story. While I don't hate this episode, it has some major downsides. Mainly that despite the episode being named after him, Duck is a very passive character. Like he hardly contributes to the episode at all, he's just stuck in the water for like 90% of the runtime. This episode is way more about James and his constant screw-ups. I'd probably enjoy this episode a bit more if it was more like Percy's Promise, and Duck would try to battle his way out of the water on his own, rather than waiting for just another engine to save him. I think that would make for a much more exciting plot than what we ended up with. 94. Hugo and the Airship. While it's much better than the other Hugo episode, Engine of the Future, Hugo and the Airship isn't really anything special. At least it actually deals with a concept specific to Hugo, and that's his striking resemblance to a nearby airship. This makes Hugo believe that he is destined to fly, like a zeppelin, but of course he actually cannot. I quite like the concept of this episode, but the fact that the other engines all believe that the flying airship actually is Hugo is a little silly. I mean, come on, that airship is way bigger, and doesn't even have a face. To be honest though, there's nothing about this episode that I find particularly noteworthy or outstanding, and Hugo still doesn't develop much as a character. He just learns that he can't fly, and that's really about it. Because of that, I'm placing this episode fairly low on the list. 93. Tobys New Friend. Philip's an alright character, but he's also somewhat of a nuisance in this episode. I'll be honest. He tries really hard to be friends with Toby, who just isn't feeling it. I'm also not really a fan of how much of a grump Toby is in this episode. Yeah, it's better than him being a coward, but I still don't think it's on par with how Toby was portrayed in the earlier seasons. As I mentioned earlier though, I like Henrietta's role and she's always a good character. The ending too was quite sweet, since Philip and Toby both get to be friends in the end. And credit where credit is due, it is nice to see Toby on Thomas's branch line and in the quarry, where he works. A decent episode, I'd say. 92. No More Mr. Nice Engine. No More Mr. Nice Engine is an episode, alright. I like the concept for the plot, with Devious Diesel gradually changing the dynamic between Hiro and the troublesome trucks. It's a rather unique idea. It pushes Hiro to his absolute limit. However, where I think the episode falls apart is the pacing. The 3-strike formula is present once more, and as a result, I think the pacing is rather sluggish. I think it could have been trimmed and the episode would have been more enjoyable that way. I do really like the presence of the troublesome trucks though, as they don't have a major role in that many episodes in this era. Hiro's character also shines through in this. He's a respectful engine, but this episode truly puts his limits to the test, compared to all of his other appearances. 91. Marion and the Dinosaurs. Marion and the Dinosaurs is another one of those spooky episodes that I don't really care for. It's not bad, sure, but I'd hesitate to call it great. It's decently well executed. Marion is a pretty humorous character after all. But despite that, I think the plot about her being scared of dinosaurs is a little silly, especially since Thomas and Percy went through that whole thing in Tale of the Brave. Surely Marion would have known better after that. I mean, she even knew what a fossil was. I will say though, I do like how this episode kickstarted the whole Samson saga. He appears at the end of this episode as a brief sneak peek for what's to come. I like how the Brenner era experimented with story structure like that. 90. Cranky at the End of the Line. This episode is alright. As with the other Cranky Carly episode, this one's a little slow, but I like the plot more. The character worrying about being replaced is nothing new. After all, we've seen such a plot like this done with Salty in season 17, but it's more about how the episode is executed. It's quite funny, such as the scene between Edward and Salty where Edward just doesn't understand what Salty is saying.
A big new fancy crane. A big shoe zebra plane. No, a big new fancy crane. A pig stew dancing lane. A big new fancy crane! Okay, no need to shout.
As well as Cranky's kind of bizarre hallucinating dream. And the ending when Cranky sees Carly for the first time and thinks his end has come is pretty good too. It's very dramatic. Where this episode falters for me though is the pacing. I mentioned before how these two episodes should have been combined into one, and this episode is partly why. Not much happens between the first act where Cranky worries about Sir Topham Hatt replacing him, and then the end where Carly is delivered to Brendan Docks. Also, the ending feels a little weird and disjointed. So, by the end of this episode, it seems like Cranky and Carly become good friends. But in the next episode, they just develop a rivalry. It kind of comes from nowhere. And I get that the rivalry stems from Carly's hardworking nature, but the ending of this episode still feels weird to me. It doesn't feel like it's setting up another episode. I think it would have been better if they foreshadowed their rivalry in this episode before moving on to the next one. 89. Reds vs. Blues. The concept of the engines bringing football teams to the stadium is an interesting idea, but unfortunately the execution is just okay. The rivalry between Thomas and James isn't anything special to me, or anything new. In fact, there's a whole special dedicated to that, Journey Beyond Sodor. I feel like they take their competition too far in this episode, to the point where they just completely neglect their jobs. It's kind of irritating. I will say though, I do like Percy's meta line near the end.
And then there was trouble.
And to be fair, there isn't anything I'd say is inherently bad about the episode. It's just that I'm not too fond of it in general. 88. Buckle Tracks and Bumpy Trucks. What a clunky title for an episode. Not to mention, the alliteration doesn't even make sense in the US version, because that one's titled Buckle Tracks and Bumpy Cars. But ignoring the title, this episode is okay. I think the plot is rather unique, dealing with how the tracks buckle and the problems they cause for the railway. We haven't really seen an episode like that before. We also see Belle and Flynn in action, fighting fires and whatnot, and the resolution, where Thomas has the idea to paint the tracks white to prevent them from being buckled by the heat, is rather clever, and I also like the montage at the beginning showing Sodor in all of its seasons. However, one major aspect that I can't stand about this episode is poking fun at Sir Topham Hatt. This episode is ridiculous with that. So first, Dowager Hatt gives Topham a white hat, and then he whines about it looking silly, and then when he wears it, the passengers just all start laughing at him. Like, can't you show him any respect? He's Sir Topham Hatt, for crying out loud. He's the controller of the premier Northwestern Railway. And anyway, it's just a silly white hat. Like, if I wore a white safari hat outside, I bet no one would bat an eye. Now, this plot point does tie into the main plot, so it's not pointless or anything, but I do wish that the poking fun at Sir Topham Hatt was dialed down a notch. Other than that, I don't have any major qualms with this episode. 87. The Frozen Turntable. And now we have a pretty fun episode, The Frozen Turntable. Now this one's about the turntable to Tidmouth's sheds being frozen, so only one engine can sleep in the sheds at night. Although the engines had agreed on letting Percy sleep there, Gordon takes the place after being unable to find another place adequate for his self-proclaimed status. But he gets his ultimate karma in the end when the turntable freezes again at a different angle, leaving him stuck in the sheds, which is an ending that I quite like. So you might be wondering why I placed this episode so low on the list. Well, to be honest, it wasn't one specific thing, but more so the fact that it suffers from being part of Season 17. You've probably gathered by this point that this season is my least favorite Brenner era season, and that's due to general issues such as slow pacing, overuse of the narrator, basic animation, Miller-esque stories, issues that I've mentioned in other Season 17 episodes. It's why I placed many of them fairly low on the list, and although I think this one is pretty okay, I do think it was still compromised by these factors. 86. No Snow for Thomas. There are some things that I quite like about No Snow for Thomas, such as the dynamic between Thomas and Emily that's portrayed in this episode. This is Emily's only real major role in Season 17, so it's nice to see her at least do something this season. She's quite snarky towards Thomas when he has to stay in the shed, which is pretty entertaining to watch. What I don't like though is the fact that Thomas refuses to wear a snowplow. This concept has been done in many episodes before, and I thought that Thomas learned his lesson in Thomas, Terrence, and the Snow, which by the way is an episode that's actually referenced later in the Brenner era. Now this doesn't necessarily ruin the episode for me though, but either way I do feel like this is one of the less original Snow episodes, which is why I think it's just average. 85. A Cranky Christmas. This episode is fine for the most part. I like how Thomas and Edward are involved in this episode, and I like the use of sandboxes in the plot as well. And I like the mayor's appearance. He's a fun character, and how Sir Topham Hatt always tries to please him, it's kind of funny. What I'm not a huge fan of in this episode is Cranky's character. For someone whose whole personality is being, well, cranky, he sure acts embarrassed about dropping one crate. I mean, I'm pretty sure he broke one in his debut episode, and yet he didn't seem to care then. I guess he's wisened up, but still I'm hesitant to say I like Cranky's portrayal here. The plot also feels somewhat unstructured, as if the episode can't really decide whether it wants to be an episode about Thomas's sandboxes or Cranky's embarrassment. It's not a huge deal breaker, but I would still call this one of the more mediocre episodes. 84. Hasty Hannah. Hannah is a mixed bag of a character for me. I like her as a contrast to Henrietta, especially given that they're sisters. That's pretty cool. However, I feel that she's a bit too hectic of a character for me to really enjoy. That's something that they loved doing in 2017, bringing in really hectic, zany, wacky characters like Carly and Lexi. Personally, I dislike these kind of characters, and Hannah is one of them. Nonetheless, Hasty Hannah is a good episode for the most part. I like Hannah's comeuppance at the end when James nearly rips her apart. It shows that although Hannah wants to go fast, it's not necessarily a good thing for her, which I'm glad was visually portrayed to enforce that message. Toby's character is fine in this. I mean, he's a little scared and he's very explicitly shaking when Hannah tries to speed him up. And he just leaves her in the middle of the line, which I've heard some complaints about, but I think it's justified since Hannah nearly caused Toby to have an accident on several occasions. He'd probably just want to get away from her as quickly as possible. If I was Toby, I mean, I'd be fed up with her and ditch her too. My only real complaint is that Hannah is just too energetic and loud of a character for me to really like her and enjoy this episode. 83. Sydney Sings. Finally, after 5 years, Sydney got his own episode. Sydney Sings is great just for the fact that it exists at all, and as an episode, it's pretty alright. It's about Sydney trying to remember his very important task that he needs to do by humming a song. I like the continuity by referencing the missing Christmas decorations, along with the fact that Percy and Sydney are firm friends. What I think is the weaker part of the episode though is Sydney's character itself. It's kind of one-dimensional. I understand that he's supposed to be a forgetful engine, but this trait is dialed up to 11 here. Like, he forgets things like every other second. It can get a little ridiculous. The episode is also somewhat repetitive, with Sydney humming the song several times throughout the episode, and he keeps on forgetting what he's supposed to do, leading him to one location after another. It's pretty entertaining, but it does kinda get old after a while. And I can't deny that Sydney is an endearing character though. When he delivers the passengers to the docks at the end and then they praise him, I felt glad for him, even though Sir Topham Hatt was not. And Sydney was overjoyed when he thought that he had another special that was pretty humorous.
Oh, you mean you want me to do another special? Oh, I'd be delighted.
Overall, I described the episode as pretty entertaining. 82. The Little Engine Who Raced Ahead. This episode is okay, but has a rather simple and unfocused plot. It introduces the character of Philip, who has come to be one of the most unpopular characters in the show. Personally, I like him okay, but he is a little annoying in this episode. That's something I've noticed with Philip. He seems to be the most annoying in his earlier episodes, but by the time we get to like season 20 and 21, he honestly isn't too bad. I get that he was written like a little kid in his introduction, as someone who likes attention and just wants others to notice him, and is oblivious to problems and hazards that he could cause by that. He nearly runs into Gordon just because he wants him to see how fast he can go. The ending where Philip believes that he won Gordon in a race is pretty fun, but I wish he wouldn't bring it up every dang time. It gets pretty old. This is more of an introduction episode, so not too much happens in it, but for what it does do and how it establishes Philip, I think it's fine enough. 81. Missing Gator. This episode is somewhat of a sequel to Tale of the Brave, and is quite unique in how it uses Gator. In general, I like how the Gator episodes were made during this season, since each one uses him in a different way. Toad's Bright Idea, for instance, takes place during Tale of the Brave, which is a first and sadly last for the franchise. Long Lost Friend has him return to Sodor one last time, and Missing Gator doesn't feature him at all, at least physically. While Gator isn't on Sodor physically, his relationship with Percy still lives on in this episode, and that's the main focus of the plot. Percy tries not to think about Gator, but while doing so, ends up accidentally letting the trucks go runaway and crash into Ulfstead Mine. He then has to face his fears by heeding Gator's words and rescuing the trucks from the mine. I quite like that plot. I don't have many major gripes with the episode, besides the fact that the trucks crashing into the mine reminds me a little too much of King of the Railway, but nonetheless I like the episode and the continuity it has. However, I don't feel like the plot itself and the moral is anything super special. It's rather basic if you ask me, so that's why I placed this episode here. 80. Samson at Your Service. I'll be honest, I don't think the Samson episodes are too bad. Like, everyone hates them. And I don't think they're the best things ever, but I do think they have their merits. Samson, I'd say, is an alright character. He can be really stupid, but that's kind of the point. That's his character. I think it's better than someone like Porter, who just has no character. That being said, I still think Samson at Your Service is a bit of a silly episode. It suffers from what I'll call the Thomas's Train Syndrome, when someone makes a mistake and doesn't realize it until well after they should've. I mean, Samson takes the express coaches all the way to the Blue Mountain Quarry, and he doesn't realize he's pulling the wrong train until he gets there? Like, surely the train was too heavy for him? I guess Samson really is a strong engine, like he says. 79. Samson Sent for Scrap. And here's another Samson episode. I like this one slightly more because of the premise, which is about Samson collecting scrap to tidy up the island. Harvey joins him too, but Samson overthinks his job and collects items that aren't actually scrap, such as a bus stop sign, a bicycle, and even Sir Topham Hatt's car. What I don't really like is that Harvey just kinda tags along. He feels like an NPC. And although he questions some of Samson's choices, he doesn't speak up about it. You'd think that he'd at least speak up about Sir Topham Hatt's car, like surely he knows what his controller's car looks like. I know he's a less outgoing character than Samson, but he probably should have spoken up regardless. Despite that though, I like the dynamic that these two have, since they're pretty much polar opposites. Samson's an outgoing, confident character who constantly screws up, while Harvey's a more reserved but sensible character. Like, the two work surprisingly well together. 78. Daisy's Perfect Christmas. Don't get me wrong, I don't dislike Daisy's Perfect Christmas, I actually quite like it. My main issue with the episode though is the conclusion. It feels rather unfulfilling. Like, not much happens other than Ryan telling Daisy that just because things didn't go her way doesn't mean that this year's Christmas was bad. Like, it's a good moral, but I wish Daisy had more of a resolution besides that. Perhaps the next day she would visit Vickerstown Station, the Arsdale Railway, the Rescue Center, all of those locations again, and this time she would embrace the new traditions. I think that would provide more of a closure and more of a satisfying ending to the episode. However, there were some good parts of the episode, such as the trucks singing Christmas carols, which was pretty funny and endearing, and of course it was great to see the Arsdale Railway again. 77. The Truth About Toby. There are some things I like about this episode. The fact that Toby isn't an absolute coward for one thing, and as I mentioned earlier, Henrietta is great as always. The plot is solid too. The engines see Toby at the scrapyard with Reg, which eventually escalates into rumors that Toby is being scrapped. It's a pretty fun and entertaining plot, but I think it would be a little far-fetched for all of the engines on Sodor to think that Sir Topham Hatt would scrap Toby. After all, he's never scrapped any of his engines before. I don't know why these rumors keep cropping up. Well, credit where credit is due though, this episode does subvert the usual trope by actually portraying Toby at the scrapyard, which is where the other engines see him and where they get the rumor. So perhaps it would be reasonable for some engines to jump to conclusions. Nevertheless, I think this is a pretty okay episode. 76. Marion and the Pipe. If only this was called Mario and the Pipe. Anyway, Marion and the Pipe is my quintessential definition of an average episode. Not good, nor bad. The plot is kinda meh, to be honest. Interesting is not the first thing I think of when I read the plot synopsis for this episode, but at the same time there's quite a bit to like about it. The subtle humor with scenes like Bill and Ben, or the close save at the end where Marion swings the stone and prevents a collision with Gordon, are pretty well executed, and I have to give this episode props for that. However, I think this is one of the more forgettable episodes on this list in terms of plot, so compared to the other episodes, I'll have to place it here. 75. The Smelly Kipper. The Smelly Kipper is a simple episode, but a fun one. After boasting one day at the sheds, James is dared by Henry to take the flying kipper. The smell of fish eventually gets the better of him, and after scuttling back to the sheds in disgrace, he has no choice but to take the train after he's scolded by Sir Topham Hatt. This is one of those episodes where execution matters, and it's done pretty well. The dialogue is great, and Henry, James, and Porter all get time in the limelight. They're all pretty strong characters here, as are the trucks, which isn't something I say too often. However, this is a Season 17 episode, and well, you all know how I feel about Season 17 by this point. 74. The Other Side of the Mountain. For some reason, people hate this episode. I think it's okay. My favorite part is the twist at the end, where it is revealed that Birdie's claims about the other side of the mountain, that it has jungly trees, a waterfall, and even a rainbow, were technically true, but were all on a poster. What people complain about the most with this episode is the crash. Yes, it's an over-the-top crash, but I still like it. Plus, it does provide Thomas with the excuse of being towed on the other side of the mountain, since he crashed so far from the rails. While I don't think this is the best Thomas episode, I think it's decent and too overhated. 73. Emily Saves the World. Emily Saves the World is a really unpopular episode, but to be honest, I quite liked it as a kid. Yeah, it's not the best, but I still think it's good fun. I mean, that title can't get more thrilling than that. Emily Saves the World. This is one of those more action-y episodes like Rusty and the Boulder. In fact, I'd describe this episode as Rusty and the Boulder on steroids. Instead of being chased by a boulder, the engines are chased by a globe instead. It chases after Thomas, James, and more until landing at Brendam Docks, all the while Emily is on a wild goose chase looking for the globe. It's a silly episode, sure, but I think it's good fun. I like the references at the beginning to the runaway elephant, Rheneas and the dinosaur, Thomas and the jet engine, Thomas, Percy and the squeak, and one of those Miller-era episodes that I never watched. As an episode mainly focusing on action and not much on story though, I'll place it around the middle of the list. 72. A Most Singular Engine. I never thought I'd see the day where Daisy and Harvey have an episode together. They're completely different, unrelated characters, but this episode works well despite all odds. I like the plot of how Diesel spreads rumors and speculation that Daisy hates Harvey and vice versa, which is a very unusual, novel, yet very Diesel thing to do. This is the stuff I like to see from Diesel, scheming and planning, which, in a way, harkens back to the original Duck and Diesel episodes, something I very much appreciate. And when Harvey and Daisy finally meet face to face, it's a very tense moment. Though I think they became friends a little too quickly. I would expect them to go for each other's guts or something, with that Eye and the Tiger music playing in the background. In general, the ending is somewhat underwhelming, especially with Diesel. Springtime for Diesel is probably more of a satisfying Diesel episode than this one is. I wish he got more of a resolution in this episode. 71. Love Me Tender. So when talking about Emily in the Middle, I said that I didn't really like how the CGI series treated Donald and Douglas, and yeah, I still don't really like them here. But this episode actually has some things going for it. Firstly, the plot is a lot more interesting, since it revolves around the coupling between Douglas and his tender breaking, so Donald ends up pulling Douglas's tender behind him as well as his own, unaware until Thomas points it out to him. I don't know if that's an intentional reference to like The Missing Coach where Donald and Douglas swap tenders, but I still like it nonetheless. I do like how as soon as Donald realizes that he has Douglas's tender, he immediately, without hesitation, goes out to look for him. I also appreciate the use of Douglas's crew, especially the scene where they're just chilling and hanging out with Toby's crew and drinking cocoa. And of course the reunion between Donald and Douglas is great too. Really, the only thing bringing this episode down for me is the arguing and bickering between the twins. Perhaps if like something else caused Douglas's tender connection to break, I would enjoy the episode a bit more. 70. Lost Property. Lost Property is about, well, the lost property of the passengers. Specifically, when two inspectors visit the railway, one of the inspector's clocks is forgotten on Thomas's train. We haven't really seen an episode with this concept prior, and I'm always fond of episodes based on new railway principles. What drags it down though is once again poking fun at the fat controller. Nothing really seems to go his way in this episode. First, a group of silly schoolchildren ruin his inspection in Annie and Clarabelle, and then he pokes himself in the eye with a string ball, twice. But with this episode's concept and story being pretty solid, I can't really rank it too low at the end of the day. Plus the dialogue is fairly good too, especially that one line between Thomas and Gordon.
Sir, I have to speak to you right away.
Oh, you don't really have to call me Sir, Thomas.
I wasn't talking to you, Gordon.
69. Toad and the Whale. Although not the tallest of Toad's heights in the Brenner era, Toad and the Whale is certainly a solid episode. Toad manages to shine here, and we get to see scenes with the search and rescue crew as well as Brenda Docks, making this quite a dynamic episode. Toad singing to the whale is quite a sweet scene, and of course the moment when he is set free and Toad bids him farewell is a strong one as well. Really the only negative about this episode is the kind of rude behavior that Duck and Oliver portray towards Toad in his singing, plus when they don't believe his whale tale. I definitely wouldn't characterize Duck and Oliver as so arrogant as they are portrayed here, to the point where they basically tell Toad to just shut up. Oliver and Toad's relationship in CGI just isn't as good as in the model series. On the bright side though, Oliver does apologize to Toad in the end, so at least he does redeem himself. 68. Spencer's VIP. And now we go from the okay episodes to the good episodes, with Spencer's VIP being the first of them. Spencer's VIP has a straightforward plot. What I like about it specifically is that it uses more of an ensemble cast. The first few minutes are about Spencer and his goof with the VIP, but afterwards the focus shifts to the other engines, who are trying desperately hard to impress the VIP, but end up just screwing up afterwards. At the end, Spencer is given another chance. The episode has a good moral too, that trying too hard can just cause problems for everyone. Some people say that the Duck and Oliver scene is shoehorned in this episode, but to be honest, I don't think that's really the case. If so, then I'd say the Gordon and James scenes are shoehorned in too. Duck and Oliver's scene is really just part of the ensemble cast if you ask me. Spencer's VIP is overall a solid episode. 67. The Switch. This episode is not just a Luke episode, but a Millie one too. Both characters are explored in quite an unorthodox way, by switching their jobs. While that sounds like a simple plot, we actually learn a lot about both Luke and Millie from this. We learn that Luke likes bustling, busy environments, and isn't really about slow or open life, and is an energetic character, whereas we learn Millie has a fear of enclosed spaces and is actually stronger than she once thought. We see Luke and Millie form a friendship, and that scene at the beginning of the episode where they face off, trying as hard as possible to impress each other, is fun enough. Plus, we get to see Ulfstead Castle, the Blue Mountain Quarry, and the Skarloey Railway engines, so I'd call this a win-win. 66. Millie and the Volcano. To be honest, I initially didn't think much of this episode at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized this episode is pretty good just for the characters alone. It stars the trio of Samson, Harvey, and Millie, and they're all pretty spot on here. Samson is his typical boastful, foolish self, Harvey is the tag-along as he was in Samson Sent for Scrap, and Millie is a somewhat spiteful engine who can get easily offended, as we've seen in other episodes such as Runaway Engine. The way these three characters bounce off each other is pretty fun, and the plan that Millie plots against Samson and Harvey is nice to see unfold. The conclusion is good too, with all three apologizing to each other, and Tubham and Dowager Hat going on a tour of the dinosaur park. All in all, a pretty decent way to end off Season 18. 65. Philip to the rescue. What really makes this episode to me is the crash. It's one of the more unique ones in my humble opinion, and it definitely stood out to me when I first watched the episode. There's a lot of tension when James is left helpless, dangling off the bridge, slowly slipping, and when he does fall, Philip shoots forward and saves James, and the shot pans out. That scene is brilliantly executed. The dialogue is also pretty good, such as at the beginning when James complains about Philip showing off, and Thomas points out his hypocrisy, and Philip's line after the crash is pretty funny.
Don't worry, I'll go and get help. Oh, wait, I can't.
I say this episode is well executed, with the build-up of tension when James begins hauling his all-too-long train, particularly with the music. However, I don't think Philip is the best character in this episode. Philip is fine, but he can come off as annoying the same way he did in The Little Engine Who Raced Ahead. 64. Gordon runs dry. The episode is rather simple, perhaps too simple. The plot is that Paxton accidentally kicks a rock on Gordon's boiler, which causes him to leak water and stop to refill all too often. Eventually, he ignores the water towers and runs out of water. What stands out to me from Gordon Runs Dry is the humor. It's pretty well written for this episode. For example, the scene when Gordon tries to name all the stations so that he won't think about water, but just gets distracted by a lake.
Tidmouth, Knapford, Crosby, Wellsworth, Marion, Cronk, a lake. Oh!
I don't know about you, but it reminds me of someone who really needs to go to the bathroom and just tries to distract himself. The dialogue between Gordon and Paxton is pretty fun too. Overall, while the plot is simple, the humor in Gordon Runs Dry really elevates the episode. 63. Wild Water Rescue. You know, Percy had a pretty good set of episodes in Season 19, and Wild Water Rescue is one of them. In this episode, the Sodor Search and Rescue Center celebrate their 1000th rescue. That's a lot of rescues. Are there really that many accidents on Sodor? Anyway, Diesel wants to get in the newspaper photo, and so he tricks Percy to go to the old abandoned quarry while he goes to pick up the mayor instead. Diesel is later pressured to save Percy, but gets himself stuck instead, leading to the Search and Rescue Center's 1001st rescue. I gotta say, both Diesel and Percy are pretty good characters in this. Percy is just excited to get in the paper, but Diesel just wants to have his own way. There's a good amount of humor sprinkled throughout the episode, and the ending with Diesel in the newspaper after all is a nice touch. Diesel even tries to make up with Percy, but it's just a shame that Diesel's turnaround doesn't stick. Oh well, typical CGI Diesel. 62. Runaway Engine. There's a lot to like about Runaway Engine. For starters, the dynamic between Glyn, Steven, and Millie is as good as always, and it's good to see Glyn become a mainstay in the Ulfstead Castle cast. We also have a brief glimpse of my beloved Skarloey railway engines, sadly for the last time in the Brenner era. What I think elevates this episode the most is the story. After not clearing garden waste for the whole day, Steven and Glyn get payback from Millie, sparking an argument between them. When Millie is mysteriously absent the next day, Steven becomes concerned that she ran away. It feels like Steven has become more douchey in the newer seasons, and I go back and forth on whether I like that or not, but it's nice to see that Steven still cares about his friends after all. It felt very genuine when he was concerned about Millie and worried that she might have run away. There's also some good humor in this episode, especially Steven's impressions of Glyn and Millie.
It wasn't fair to leave it for me. And where on earth have you two been?
Which in particular amused me. And the bantering between Steven and Glyn when the Earl tries to tell them about their jobs for the day. That was pretty fun as well. 61. Who's Jeffrey? I think Who's Jeffrey is one of the funniest episodes in the Brenner era, just because of its outlandish concept. Thomas just makes up a whole new engine, which in itself has spawned some interesting things. I remember back when the episode's title was first announced, how the wiki thought that Jeffrey was a new character and just made a page for him, before realizing that he wasn't actually real. But on to the episode itself. I like how Thomas's lies just snowball and he has to keep making up new things, before the bubble eventually bursts and the cat is out of the bag. That is, Thomas's lie is exposed. The near crash with Spencer is great also, as is Thomas's impression of Jeffrey. My latest rewatch was actually the first time I watched the UK dub of the episode, so I was kinda surprised when I realized the UK impression of Jeffrey is quite different from the US dub.
Hello, this is Jeffrey. Sorry I can't come out, sir.
Hello, this is Jeffrey. Sorry I can't come out, sir.
it was quite amusing nonetheless. 60. Pouty James. The two James episodes in Season 20 were both really good. Pouty James, in my opinion, is the lesser of the two. But that doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, it's a strong episode just for its humor. I know I've been mentioning humor a lot, but the Brenner era really was chock full of humorous moments, and Pouty James may just be one of the best in terms of comedy. The faces of the engines were all very expressive. That one panning shot where James has to take trucks and becomes glummer and glummer is great. The faces that the other engines make to cheer up James are entertaining, and even some of Topham's phrases made me chuckle.
You need to change your attitude, young steam engine. Well, engines today.
The only joke that didn't land for me was that moo joke at the end.
Did somebody order some milk? Moo!
I didn't realize this until this latest rewatch, but Season 20 has like 3 cow jokes. Like, what's up with that? Besides that though, Pouty James is a good episode. 59. 3 Steam Engines Gruff. Okay, this may be just the most controversial pick of my list. Now, I've defended this episode several times on Twitter before, because I think it's a genuinely good episode. Let me explain my reasons. Firstly, this is the only episode of the entire Brenner era, and I'm pretty sure it's the only episode in CGI at all, to feature the Farquhar trio, Thomas, Percy, and Toby. Also, Trevor makes his grand speaking return here. And the atmosphere and tension in this episode is great. It had a lot of build-up. That scene where Percy just absolutely obliterates Henry is great, and that scene at the end where Thomas has to cross the bridge is killing me with tension. I also like the story inspiration from the 3 Billy Goats gruff. The story is even mentioned in the episode. The reenacting of the 3 engines crossing the bridge is an atmospherically great scene, full of tension. Where I think the episode falls flat, though, is the characters of Thomas, Percy, and Toby. They're all scaredy engines in this episode, and I think having Toby be a foil to Thomas and Percy's scariness would have worked better here. Also, I originally thought that this episode was going to be an Arsdale episode when the title was announced, and that was before the Small Railway Engines adaptations were announced. I definitely would have preferred that just for my Arsdale Railway bias alone, but nevertheless, I still think the positives outweigh the negatives with this episode. 58. Last Train for Christmas. So we go from a very unpopular episode that I like more than most people, to a very popular episode that I like less than most people do. Now don't get me wrong, Last Train for Christmas is a great episode, but I think it has one major flaw, and that's that the plot is kind of unfocused. It's more of an ensemble episode and jumps from character to character. It goes from Thomas to Connor to Hiro to the slip coaches, and it doesn't really feel like the characters connect together cohesively. It just feels like one action happens after another. However, all of the scenes themselves are great. Connor's determination to get that last Christmas train done is admirable, and the collective efforts of the engines to clear Connor's way are rewarding to see unfold. The use of the slip coaches is great, as is the bit with Thomas mistaking Harold for a Christmas sleigh, which actually pays off at the end when there is a Christmas sleigh. There's really a lot to like about Last Train for Christmas, but it's not my favorite episode of the season, and I don't think it's as good as most people say it is. 57. The Lost Puff. The Lost Puff is one of those episodes that I just love, just because it has Paxton in it. He's definitely one of my favorite characters from the CGI era, and this episode shows exactly why. He's funny, he's silly, and he's endearing. Him getting distracted by the duck is pretty funny, as is him running along the bumpy line quickly. He falsely believes that Thomas has literally lost a puff, which is actually a saying. That scene with Paxton and Stephen at Olmsted Castle looking at a cloud is perhaps the funniest bit out of season 17 in its entirety, especially Stephen's reaction afterwards.
Well, that's just a cloud.
Yes, of course. I knew that.
Although this is a 3-strike formula episode, I can overlook that because of the humor this episode provides, as well as Paxton's entertaining character. 56. The Way She Does It. Daisy really is a great character in the Brenner era. It says something when we're this far on the list, and there's still 3 Daisy episodes to come, not including this one. This episode highlights Daisy's pompous nature above all else. She boasts so much about her special job that she overthinks it and ends up believing that it's grander than it was in actuality. Some scenes here are great, especially the one between her, Duck, and Oliver. This episode was also when her French trait began popping up. I don't mind it here to be honest, but I feel like it was overused in season 21, but used well here. I mean, she believes that her train is the classiest thing ever, so her use of French, the traditionally classy language, is pretty fitting.
Incroyable.
At least I can understand what she is saying at all as someone who's currently learning French. But there is one thing in this episode that I hate, and that's Thomas mentioning Misty Island.
Ooh, I know. Going to Misty Island?
Okay, nah, I'm just kidding. I don't mind it that much. If anything, I find it pretty funny. 55. Thomas the Babysitter. Some people don't like this episode because of the crying baby, and I get it, but to be honest, I don't mind it all that much. If anything, I find this episode endearing, particularly the ending when Thomas takes a tired mother on a special train, and her, the baby, as well as Annie and Clarabelle all fall asleep. Albert's reveal at the end is great too, and Topham giving him a week off to take care of their son is just the nicest thing ever. Nice to see that he's a good boss, as well as a good controller, and the fact that they named their baby after Thomas is great too. Oh, and there's that one shot of Topham trying to pet the baby that's pretty funny and a popular meme. Overall, I like this episode for how sweet it is. If executed well, I like the slower paced episodes just as much as the actiony ones, and I think Thomas the Babysitter is a great example of that. 54. Springtime for Diesel. This is a pretty great Diesel episode, not just because it features the duo of Diesel and Daisy, a pairing that hasn't been seen before at all, but also because of Diesel's redemption. That's what everyone knows this episode for, and to give it credit, the scene when Diesel apologizes to Daisy is very well executed. For once, Diesel feels heartfelt and sincere, and afterwards, when he doesn't bump into Daisy but instead greets her like a friend, it shows redemption for Diesel, signs of change. This may just be the best Diesel redemption episode in CGI, however, I don't feel like it's a be-all, end-all for Diesel's deviousness. Even if a most singular engine took place before this episode, like everyone wants to, Diesel still acts like his usual self in the Big Freeze. I don't think the writers intended this to be Diesel's final episode like people perceive this episode as. Like, I could make just as good of an argument for, say, Disappearing Diesels or Diesel's Ghostly Christmas to be Diesel's permanent redemption episode, because on their own, they're just as much redemption episodes for Diesel as this one. Because of that, this episode isn't placed as high as it could have been, but it is still an enjoyable episode nonetheless. 53. Skiff and the Mermaid. This is one of the few times when poking fun at Sir Topham Hatt is done well, and I actually like it. I usually hate the poking fun at Topham trope, but I think it's executed brilliantly in this episode just because of how absurd and self-aware it is. In Skiff and the Mermaid, Skiff and Topham end up abandoned on an island, with nothing to do but call for help. I love the way the situation just continually escalates from Topham losing his rowing paddles, to him trying to make a fire, to him just going borderline insane. It gives me Lady Hatt's birthday party vibes, with how the situation just escalates from bad to worse, but it's genuinely enjoyable. There are several other gags, such as Captain Joe flinging his hands in the air when he realizes that Skiff escaped to sea, and then Topham's grandkids just suddenly shaking their heads knowing that Topham would not survive a second in the wild. The story isn't the most exciting, but all the Topham stuff totally makes up for it. "52. Henry in the Dark." Seriously, this episode was begging for merchandise, like Streamline Emily? Nah, glow-in-the-dark Henry would be way cooler. Anyway, this episode is a nice change of pace compared to the usual Halloween-themed episodes. And Henry actually isn't a complete scaredy cat for once. Wow! No, seriously, Season 20 treated the character very well. The fact that Henry didn't go completely insane when seeing his glowy self in the mirror is actually good, and he even pulls a trick on the other engines. Now that's the classic Henry that I was hoping for. The characters in general are all pretty spot on in this episode, and I commend this episode for subverting the scaredy Henry trope that's been done to death before. I don't have much else to say about the episode other than that, so let's move on. 51. Best Engine Ever. Now this may not be the best episode ever, but it's pretty up there. It might just be my favorite Emily episode just because of her and Caitlin's dynamic. Caitlin is like a celebrity idol to Emily, and Emily is just a wannabe character, and the two really bounce off each other well here. I like how Caitlin's weaknesses, such as her skirt and her inability to pull trucks, come into play as well. It's cleverly written, and it makes Emily realize that Caitlin isn't better in everything than her. I also like the focus on female characters. I tend to complain about them being shoehorned, like with Nia and Rebecca for example, but when they're written pretty naturally, such as in this episode, then it's done pretty well, especially with the use of secondary characters here such as Marion. The runaway at the end is great too, and I like the role reversal of Emily taking Caitlin to the Steamworks at the end, when it was Caitlin hauling Emily to the Steamworks at the beginning. For a pairing that hasn't been done before or since, Caitlin and Emily's dynamic is done excellently. 50. Old Reliable Edward. There's few things I like more than a good original Edward episode. I'll admit this one isn't the most original by any stretch of the imagination, but dang it, my Edward bias is too strong. Edward, Thomas, and Gordon's dynamic is just like the good old days, quite similar to The Adventure Begins in fact. The plot is once again about Gordon making fun of Edward and being condescending to him because of his old age, but this time, Thomas decides to trick Gordon and teach him a lesson. The episode is very reminiscent of Edward and Gordon, since Edward being a banker to Gordon is a major plot point, which we've seen in other episodes such as Edward the Really Useful Engine. However, I'd say the writing and dialogue trumps that one by far. Old Reliable Edward feels like a love letter to the elderly Blue Engine, and I'm all here for it. 49. Gone Fishing. Not only is this episode a reference to the song of the same name, it's also my favorite Harvey episode of the Brenner era. Although Harvey is still somewhat self-conscious here, he also learns to take situations with humor, something that I think is a good lesson for anyone to learn. Porter, Bill, and Ben all have good supporting roles here. This episode might just be my favorite appearance of Porter's because of the lesson he teaches Harvey, plus incorporating his domes and the water off a hump's back saying is a nice touch. And although Bill and Ben aren't exactly supporting here, they're still fun and unlike other episodes, don't feel like bullies, just two engines who want to have some fun, which is especially evident by the ending. In summary, Gone Fishing is a well-composed episode with characters that I all like. 48. Two Wheels Good. What I like about Two Wheels Good is how whimsical it is. Perhaps whimsical isn't the word, but there's something about this episode that feels like the writer had this random episode idea and just went all into it. This episode begins with Thomas, Spencer, and Bertie hotly debating about whose wheels are the best. Everyone, of course, thinks the respective number of wheels is the best, but when Spencer takes the Duke and Duchess of Boxford to Cowan Castle on his 20 wheels, he breaks down, and so Thomas is to take them on 6 wheels. But then he runs onto a branch on the line, passing them on to Bertie, who gets a flat tire, until eventually Mr. Percival on his 2-wheeled bike calls for Harold to help on a nearby telephone booth, and at last, Harold takes the Duke and Duchess to Cowan Castle using no wheels. I mean, I like just how the episode escalates until at last, it reaches its twist ending, with no wheels at all. That's definitely what makes it stand out to me. 47. The Missing Christmas Decorations. The Missing Christmas Decorations is a very unique episode. It's the only seasonal episode at all to feature Diesel 10, which is already a highlight, but it also does something with Sydney. In a way, this is a mini-sequel to Day of the Diesels, which some may dislike, but personally, I'd say it's Day of the Diesels done right. Sure, Diesel 10's motives of stealing the decorations is a little silly, but I'd say it's executed well for what it's worth. But no doubt my favorite part of the episode is when Sydney gets new wheels. I love the Sydney stuff in this episode, not just because of its continuity, but also because Sydney actually does something. I like Norman's reference to Day of the Diesels, and seeing Sydney on rails was kind of surreal at the time, considering his only other appearances up to that point were stuck up on the hoist. Though I have to wonder, what happened to Diesel 10 after this episode? We never see him again at the Diesel Works afterwards. Did he move? Was he banished? Scrapped? 46. Very Important Sheep. I'm not really sure why I put this episode so high. Its plot is rather simple. It's about Percy accidentally poking a hole in his van with sheep, so they all eventually run out. I'd say it's the humor that won me over. This episode has a lot of great jokes. There are subtle ones like Topham saying "yous" as in baby sheep, and Percy misunderstanding it as in "you," the pronoun.
And Percy, I need you to go to Farmer McCall's farm and collect his new spring lambs and ewes.
Me, sir?
No, ewes.
There is also a plethora of visual comedy. The scene in particular where all the sheep boarded Annie was very well done. They certainly were first-class passengers. I also enjoyed the spring theme of the episode. We don't get many explicitly spring-themed episodes in Thomas, so this one was a treat. And lastly, I like Trevor's appearance, even if we have to wait one more year to hear him talk. 45. Thomas's Shortcut. Some of the strongest episodes in Thomas are the ones that focus on Thomas and his branch line. At first, they may not seem like the most interesting or unique episodes, but what I like about them is how grounded they are, by which I mean they're very realistic and tend to be centered around real railway subjects or problems, and because of that they feel very close to the Railway series. Thomas's shortcut specifically is about Bertie's bus service being rerouted due to construction. As someone who takes the bus to and from school every day, I can totally relate to that. Thomas wants to try and find a shortcut to match Bertie's shorter route, but ends up crashing instead. Thomas is notorious for being all over the place in this era, but in the branchline episodes, this one included, he's definitely the most in character. He's his just classic cheeky self, and the rivalry dynamic between him and Bertie really highlights that. Not to mention, this is the first time we saw Harvey in CGI. You know, I'm noticing that all of the returnees return in good episodes. 44. Thomas and the Emergency Cable. And here's yet another strong Thomas-centric episode. Many of its strengths are similar to Thomas's shortcut, but I like the railway-related theme of this episode just a bit more. Thomas and the Emergency Cable is, well, about the emergency cable, a railway subject that hasn't been featured in the series before. Thomas is once again in character. He doesn't feel too nice or too mean, and his anger towards the birdwatcher feels justified, to the point where he deliberately tried not to pick him up. I also appreciate how there's no character in the moral right or wrong here. The birdwatcher was wrong to pull the emergency cable, but Thomas was just as wrong to try and leave him behind. I like the episodes where the characters are morally gray. It's a fresh take compared to the typical black and white stories. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with stories where one character's in the clear right and the other's in the wrong. After all, Audrey had written plenty of these stories, but I also like the stories when the characters are in the gray, because it strengthens more of the characters, and leaves the stories more open to interpretation. 43. Wayward Winston. I appreciate Wayward Winston for its action. For season 17, a relatively action-free season, this episode is a great change of pace. The runaway sequence with Winston is great, and reminds me of Busy Going Backwards, which I think is one of the strongest episodes of season 5. Thomas's chase after Winston mirrors Oliver's chase after Toad from that episode. Speaking of which, I like Thomas's chase after Winston, and both of their near misses. I also like Winston's turnaround when he realizes that he doesn't want adventure after all. The ending where he almost crashes but stops just in time is full of tension. And remember how with the previous episode I liked how the characters were both in the wrong in some way? Well, the same applies here with Winston and Topham Hatt. If anything, I think it strengthens their relationship. Winston learns to appreciate Topham more and have more patience for him, and Topham learns to care more for Winston. 42. Ryan and Daisy. I wouldn't have thought Ryan and Daisy would make such a strong pair, but, well, they do. They are great contrasts, with Ryan being the eager, helpful one, whereas Daisy is picky and particular. Put them together, and you get this episode. Once again, I like how both characters have faults here. Daisy obviously shouldn't have tried to get out of her jobs, but Ryan also shouldn't have just accepted Daisy's continuous requests, and should have cared more about his own health. It shows what a friendship should and shouldn't look like. It's a shame that this was Ryan's only real episode, because he's quite a likable character, and I would have liked to see more episodes between him and Daisy, or even other characters like Duck or the Arsdale engines. 41. Snow Place Like Home. Snow Place Like Home is the only Victor episode in the Brenner era, and he really knocked it out of the park here. I like how this episode builds on Victor's Cuban origin, with his unfamiliarity and hatred towards the snow. His relationship with Kevin shines through here. Despite him scolding and warning Kevin a lot, as soon as he hears about him being stuck in the snow, he doesn't hesitate to venture out to save him. It shows he cares about his friend so much that he'd be willing to face his mortal enemy in order to find him. It's also just nice to see Victor out of the Steamworks for once. It's refreshing. I will say, this episode feels like it goes back and forth between the Victor, Kevin, and Thomas scenes a little too often, but at the end of the day, that's a minor complaint. This episode is still great. 40. Dowager Hatt's Busy Day. One of the most chaotic episodes in the series is Dowager Hatt's Busy Day, and that's not an understatement. It's essentially the Brenner era spin on the Green Controller, except Topham's old mother is the one to replace him. At first she uses the engines for her own errands, which of course causes a lot of confusion and delay, as you might imagine. By far the best part of the episode is seeing the engines with all sorts of wacky trains that the crew could never have a chance to use normally, such as Percy with the Express, or even background eye candy such as Ari and Bert with the slip coaches. Some of these trains are even used to poke jabs at the Miller era, such as the balloon being a reference to one of the most infamous episodes in the series, Up, Up, and Away, or the giraffe being a reference to Thomas's tall friend. Dowager Hat is a funny character too. Keith Wickham voices her surprisingly well, and I'm glad she got a whole episode to call her own. Her misnaming the engines is funny, especially since that leads into a Who's Jeffrey reference.
Oh, excellent. Now, Jeffrey.
Jeffrey? Who's Jeffrey?
The only thing that I wasn't a fan of was Topham's handkerchief getting stuck on Percy's nose. That was a little too gross for my liking. Lee Pressman really went wild when writing this episode, and I think it paid off. 39. Henry Gets the Express. Henry in the Dark was good, but Henry Gets the Express was great. It was a truly great portrayal of Henry and Gordon's dynamic, very reminiscent of episodes like Whistles and Sneezes or Off the Rails, where Gordon didn't really respect Henry, but also felt somewhat threatened by him. At the end of the episode, Gordon is horrified when he is told that Henry could very well pull the Express forever. Henry as a character is great here. It's the closest he's been to his persona from the early seasons in ages. Although a somewhat unconfident engine at first, he soon begins to enjoy himself when he actually takes the Express. As for Gordon, he's entertaining as well, and we get to truly see how he deals with non-Express jobs. I will say this episode feels more like a Gordon episode than a Henry one, but just because Gordon feels like a more prominent character, but both are featured sufficiently enough. This episode feels very much like something from Season 1 or Season 2, which is ultimately the reason why I like it so much. 38. Percy's Lucky Day. Percy's Lucky Day is a great episode exploring the subject of superstition. When everything seems to go wrong for Percy one day, Stephen decides to give him a lucky horseshoe, which Percy drops immediately. Suddenly, things go well for him, but when he is tasked with rescuing Bill and Ben, he realizes that his horseshoe is missing. He pushes through and saves the twins anyway. I'd say this episode has a pretty strong moral about superstition, and it's great to see Bill and Ben return to CGI. Their minor roles in this episode are great. One thing that I noticed upon my rewatch is that this episode is fall themed, something that actually persists in Bill or Ben, their other major role this season. 37. The Perfect Gift. This may not be the perfect episode, but it is up there. It's the first episode featuring Reg, and when rewatching, this was the episode that made me appreciate Reg more than I initially had. The juxtaposition of him being a scrapping crane, but him being like a jolly fellow, is great, and his dynamic with Percy in this episode is strong too. I also like that Reg is kind of a creative type, which we see in this episode when he makes the scrapped Christmas tree, and is further explored in Season 21 when he makes a music speaker system. It's pretty cool that he's a creative character. That's pretty creative in itself, considering that, most engines don't get a chance to be creative because they can't pick up stuff and stuff, but Reg actually can, and I like that they take advantage of that. As for the episode itself though, it's a really sweet Christmas episode between Percy and Reg. Percy seems to be one of the most festive characters in the show, as we see in episodes such as the missing Christmas decorations, and it shows in this episode when he tries to show Reg the Christmas spirit. But at the same time, Reg celebrates the festive season in his own ways. The ways Reg misunderstands Percy's gifts, such as when he cuts apart the tree that Percy gave him, is funny as well. There's more to Reg than I initially thought. 36. Thomas the Quarry Engine. And now we get to the episodes that I love. Thomas the Quarry Engine is another one of those Thomas episodes that I like, and this one also features Mavis and Diesel. This is Mavis's only big role in the Brenner era, which is partly the reason why this episode is so high on the list, but the main reason is because of Thomas himself. His character feels spot on here, like he was straight out of Season 3 or Season 4. It's also nice to see him at the quarry, a location which we haven't seen too often in CGI lately. Not to mention Diesel's dynamic with Mavis is great too. And of course, as I mentioned several times before, the fact that no character was in the moral right or wrong is a positive too. Like, Thomas shouldn't have been so impatient, but at the same time, Diesel shouldn't have spent so much time with Mavis and just delaying her return to the quarry. Overall, a very well-rounded Thomas episode. 35. Terrence Breaks the Ice. The fact that Terrence, of all characters, returned in CGI and got a whole episode to call his own still blows my mind to this day. And it's a pretty great episode too, harkening back to Terrence's roots from the first season. The flashback from Thomas, Terrence in the Snow is great as well, albeit it's a little stretched out. The dynamic between Terrence and Thomas is as strong as ever, and we get to see Terrence being the one to get into trouble for a change. Some people don't really like that, but personally it's a fun idea. The sequence of Thomas saving Terrence is very strong too, full of tension. There isn't much I can fault Terrence Breaks the Ice for. It's a well-paced episode with a solid plot and a fan-favorite character. 34. Toad's Adventure. The first CGI episode featuring Oliver and Toad. Now, say what you want about them, but they sure started off with a bang. Toad's Adventure is an episode reminiscent of Busy Going Backwards, a personal favorite of mine. The plot is similar. Toad wishes for an adventure, anything more than trundling behind Oliver's trains all day. He gets his wish when James couples him to his train, but the monkey's paw is that James is a very careless engine. This causes the train along with Toad to go loose and run down Gordon's Hill. And while there isn't a wild chase like in Busy Going Backwards, there is one of the nearest crashes in the Brenner era, and that's the next best thing. Besides the striking similarity to Busy Going Backwards, what else do I like about the episode? Well, Toad and James interacting together is great. These characters bounce off each other really well. For a season 18 episode, the action is very well done, not to mention the music. The only thing I don't really like though is Oliver's character. He's too boastful towards Toad, more than he ever was in any of the model seasons. His role is a minor one though, so the complaint is only a small one at the end of the day. 33. Calm Down Caitlin. The singular reason I like this episode is Caitlin's character. She's very entertaining in this episode. The dialogue between her and the other characters is undoubtedly the best part, such as when Henry tells her to pull a Flying Kipper and Gordon eagerly agrees with him. The episode is generally well written, above average for a season 17 episode, which is high praise coming from myself. The ending is fun, with Caitlin falling asleep on the mainland, and in general, Caitlin is a fun character because of how enthusiastic she is. I really don't have much to say about this episode, it's just well done. 32. PA Problems. Now this is one of the best episodes of Season 21, and really shows what a Season 21 episode can be when its strongest elements are combined. The plot is an original one, revolving around Sir Topham Hatt's new PA system, which unfortunately doesn't work as intended. This results in many entertaining sequences of the engines taking their deliveries to the wrong places and passengers boarding the wrong trains. A very entertaining sequence indeed. The moral of the old being just as useful as the new is a great moral to bring across, but my favorite part of the episode without a doubt are the characters of Edward and Reg. Reg is one of those characters who we haven't seen in a while, so it's nice to see him get some of the sweet spotlight, and to see him delve into music as well. He can get a little overboard, which is a criticism I have a lot with Season 21 episodes, but he's not all too bad here. As for Edward, he is the perfect character to convey the moral of the episode, and I only wish Mattel kept this moral in mind instead of kicking out Edward from the main cast. Anyway, PA Problems is a stellar episode. 31. Mucking About. While the BWBA era got 3 whole episodes about the pack, the Brenner era only got 1. However, the episode that we did get is one of the more memorable ones. It features Max and Monty, characters who previously appeared in Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, but didn't speak. This is their chance in the spotlight, and they're as mischievous as ever. I think the thing I like the most about the episode is just seeing the pack work together. We didn't see the characters much in Lost Treasure due to the prominent main plot and the huge roster of returnees, so it's great to see Jack, Alfie, Oliver, Max, and Monty all interact together. It's interesting to see their various dynamics, especially Oliver's since he's sort of the leader character. At least that's the vibe I got from him. I don't know if it's ever explicitly confirmed. The plot is great also, it feels ripped right out of the Pack miniseries. Max and Monty crisscrossing Thomas at the beginning is entertaining, as is the ending, where they dump the waste onto the tracks and onto Thomas. Seeing the cop from Lost Treasure was great. There's just so much to like about this episode. 30. Slow Steven. This episode really highlights how much Season 19 stepped up when it came to action. This is arguably one of the actioniest episodes of the season, and for good reason. The slow foreshadowing of the suspension bridge falling apart is well done. It's not told to us or anything, we just see the bridge slowly creaking and screws falling off, making for a very ominous scene. And of course, that ending. It's very well done indeed, and the tension only increases as the bridge begins to collapse more and more, and the engines as well as Annie and Clarabelle begin to stress more and more. It culminates in the suspension bridge tilting to the side as the characters all watch in disbelief. A truly great climax if I've ever seen one. 29. Disappearing Diesels. Paxton is a very entertaining character, but combining with Diesel, and you've got an even more entertaining episode. Disappearing Diesels is really just an episode where Diesel plays a trick on Paxton, but it's played out so brilliantly that I can't help but enjoy it. The sequence at the beginning with all the Diesels hiding away from Paxton was hilarious, and so was Diesel imitating Reg.
Is that Diesel over there, Reg?
No, it isn't.
You know, I think I have a thing for Thomas characters doing imitations. Anyway, I also like Paxton and the other Diesels reuniting at the end. The other Diesels feel guilty, but Paxton's not even mad and is just happy to see them. He's such an endearing character, and it's why I like Paxton as much as I do. 28. Santa's Little Engine. This is one of the few times that Topham actually gets an episode to himself. In Santa's Little Engine, Sir Robert Norby convinces Topham to dress up as Santa for the Christmas party, including riding a sleigh. Topham is hesitant, and so he tries to pass off Winston as a sleigh, but of course Robert's having none of that and tells Topham that he has to ride in a real sleigh. So he does, but ends up accidentally breaking loose, resulting in a pretty cool chase scene. That scene combined with Topham's pretty fun characterization here is what put this episode so high on the list. This is one of those episodes that I don't have much to say about besides that it's done very well and I enjoyed it. 27. Bradford the Brake Van. Bradford is a very fun character, much better than Hugo of the same season. He's such a stickler to the rules, and it drives the other engines crazy. His character is very exaggerated. Bradford is a hyperbole, and that's what makes his character work so well. I also enjoy the fact that they paired him up with Samson, since they're both such contrasting characters, but also so exaggerated. I just wish we saw more of the duo in this episode. I don't have much else to talk about other than Bradford's enjoyable and humorous portrayal, so for the sake of not repeating myself, I'll move on. 26. The Fastest Red Engine on Sodor. This episode has a lot going for it in my opinion. I've seen mixed reactions about the episode, but personally it's one of the most memorable ones of the season. Rosie makes her grand reintroduction in this episode, and although she doesn't appear much afterwards, what they do with her in here is pretty good. I just wish she had more episodes because she is a pretty strong character here, and a great contrast to how she was characterized in earlier episodes. But of course the best part about the Fastest Red Engine on Sodor is the insane crash. It's genuinely one of the best crashes in the series, up there with The Adventure Begins and A Better View for Gordon. James just crashes into Tidmouth's sheds at such an insane speed that the crash is very impactful. And although A Shed for Edward is an episode, I like that this one tried to create an arc spanning multiple episodes, something they experimented with quite a bit in season 21. The only thing I don't really like is the usage of brake fluid, since steam engines don't have brake fluid. You'd think that this team wouldn't make such a mistake, especially since they have a railway consultant on board, but that's a discussion for another day. 25. The Missing Breakdown Train. You know, I'm surprised that they pulled off an episode featuring the breakdown train of all characters. It's honestly great to see Judy and Jerome in an episode, and it also answers the question of what happened to the breakdown train after the adventure begins. The meta reference to Rocky essentially replacing them was great, but my favorite part was seeing Judy and Jerome travel all around the island, interact with various characters such as Ryan, Oliver, and Skiff, and react to different locations and situations, like when they complain about the plainness of the farm, the seagulls at Arsborough Harbor, or the noise of the Blue Mountain Quarry. They really did a good job portraying Judy and Jerome and making them interesting characters. There aren't many episodes featuring rolling stock, so the fact that this episode exists at all, and pulls its plot off so well, is amazing. 24. The Christmas Coffee Pot. And we have another episode featuring a character from The Adventure Begins. It's Glenn, who, as we find in this episode, was abandoned in an old siding and eventually forgotten about. It's great that he makes a return to the Christmas Coffee Pot. I actually didn't think that he might return, and that I thought that he'd be just a one-off and The Adventure Begins. The first part of the episode is about Marion thinking she discovered a talking tree, who in actuality was Glenn. The reunion between Thomas and Glenn was very well done. It definitely felt like a heartwarming reunion between the two after such a long time. There are a couple of criticisms that I have about the episode though. One is that the Marion plot was kind of dropped midway through the episode to make way for the rest of the plot. Speaking of which, the other kind of subplot is about Glenn worrying that Sir Topham Hatt will scrap him once he finds out about him. Now I've complained a lot about these kind of plots, and to be honest, I wasn't super impressed with this one either. So why is the episode so high on the list? Well, because the elements that were done well, such as Thomas's reunion with Glenn and Topham getting to ride Glenn again for the first time in years, are done perfectly. Topham even mentions that he built Glenn himself, which is a really cool detail. 23. Den and Dart. Every once in a while, I stumble upon an episode that I didn't really care for or remember much of, but after rewatching, I surprisingly really enjoy the episode. In this list, it's Den and Dart. So what makes Den and Dart so special? Well, the fact that Den and Dart have their characters so expanded. Before this episode, there really wasn't much to them. There's that "what he means is" trope that Dart did.
Sorry, Mavis, I didn't realise you were in a rush. It's just,
What he means is, we'll get you back on the rails just as soon as we can.
And the two are the repaired diesels at the diesel works. And that's about it. But this episode actually subverts and explores their trope by having a plot about separation anxiety. We see how much Den and Dart are in sync with each other. They're like yin and yang. And when they're separated from each other, they feel incomplete. We see this when Den struggles to formulate his own words in the quarry, and Dart isn't there to help him finish his sentences.
You troublesome trucks are so... You're so, well, what I mean is...
This episode puts a new spin on the "what he means is" trope, and turns from a one-trick pony to something that actually helps explain Den and Dart's relationship. They're completely different classes of diesel, and yet they're like twins, shown by their difficulty from being apart. Another thing that I love about this episode is how Toby and Mavis are the mentors to Den and Dart, and help them overcome their troubles, especially Toby, since this is perhaps the most in character he's ever been in the entire Brenner era. This unusual quartet make a really good episode, and I actually wish Den and Dart had more episodes after this. 22. The Railcar and the Coaches. Unusual pairings are one of the strongest aspects of the Brenner era, and nowhere is that more evident than in The Railcar and the Coaches, as it features Daisy, Annie, and Clarabelle all in one episode. It feels like a throwback to Daisy's very first episode, and I like how annoyed Annie and Clarabelle are with her, enough so to plan a payback against her. I also like how they actually get in trouble at the end. Annie and Clarabelle are usually the ones to warn and correct Thomas when he's in the wrong, so it's nice to see a different side to them here. Daisy, of course, is as strong as always, and the moral of two wrongs not making a right is a nice one too. Overall, a very solid episode. 21. Letters to Santa. And now we have another Christmas episode from Season 20. Letters to Santa is a wonderful homage to Percy and Harold, as this episode expands on Percy and Harold's relationship. I love seeing that rivalry between Percy and Harold, just like when they first met. They didn't really do something like that in a long time. I also enjoy that both Percy and Harold have their shortcomings in the story. Percy can't make it through the snowdrift, and Harold runs out of fuel. The ending, when Percy brings Harold the fuel, is very heartwarming indeed. The struggle of Harold pushing through the blizzard is an intense moment also as he tries to catch up with Hiro, and I particularly like how there's a cliffhanger and we are left in the dark as to what happened to Harold before Percy sets off to find him. It's kind of unusual for the Brenner era to provide us with a cliffhanger like this. What a well-written episode this was. 20. Blown Away. Well, I guess you could say I was blown away by this episode. Despite being a small railboat, Skiff gets an awesome episode where he is blown off by a storm, crashes into a tree, and saves Duck and Oliver from crashing into said tree. The cast of this episode is very strong, especially Duck and Oliver. But my absolute favorite moment is when Skiff tries to stop Duck and Oliver from crashing. The build-up is very well executed, and there's a sense of urgency and panic when Skiff finds out that there's not one engine, but two that he has to save. The moment when Skiff manages to free his sail is a very triumphant one, as is the resolution. Overall, Blown Away is a very strong episode with an amazing climax. 19. Duncan the Humbug. Man, I love the Duncan episodes in CGI. I think Duncan the Humbug is the weaker of the two, and I would still say it's an excellent episode. Duncan was handled so well in CGI. Despite his visual shortcomings, his character isn't tainted at all, and is very accurate to how he was back in the model series. Duncan the Humbug is a Christmas episode, and Duncan is challenged not to complain at all for an entire day. Although he eventually fails, he redeems himself by helping out Luke when he's trying to get up a hill. One thing that I love about this episode is that it actually features the Skarloey Railway and not just the Blue Mountain Quarry, and is one of the very few episodes to do so. And it sure looks beautiful. Some of these scenes are just amazing to look at. They are some of the best scenes in CGI, period. The characters themselves are all great too, not just Duncan, but also others such as Scarloey and Rusty. And lastly, the resolution is a very nice one, with Duncan getting his new paint after all, and promising to be less grumpy in future. Everything about this episode is great, from the use of the Scarloey Railway, to the beautiful animation, to the solid story. 18. Toad's Bright Idea. This episode does something that I wish more episodes experimented with. It takes place during the events of a special, Tale of the Brave. We actually see a brief scene from Tale of the Brave in this episode, incorporated right into the story. Speaking of the story, it's a great one, showing new sides to both Toad and Gator's characters. The two both have different contrasting ideologies, which escalates into a conflict and Gator eventually loses patience and abandons Toad. I like this because it shows a new side to Gator's character that we haven't really seen before, impatience. Prior to this episode, he didn't really have any flaws. He just took the role of the mentor character for Percy in Tale of the Brave and Missing Gator. But in this episode, we actually do see a flaw of his. I like that they experimented with the character choices as well. Gator works pretty well with Toad. The characters really are the strongest part of the story. For such a random, odd duo, Gator and Toad actually work very well together, and that's why Toad's Bright Idea is this high up on the list. 17. Diesel's Ghostly Christmas, Part 1. Next on the list we have an episode that experimented with being a two-parter. Diesel's Ghostly Christmas is the only direct two-parter of the Brenner era, and before I get into the nitty-gritty, I'll preface by saying this. I classify Diesel's Ghostly Christmas as 2 episodes despite airing in some territories as a single episode for 2 reasons. 1, each part is the length of a normal episode, and 2, if you'd only consider Diesel's Ghostly Christmas as 1 episode, Season 19 would just have 25 episodes instead of 26 like every other season. So with that out of the way, let's get to the plot. Diesel's Ghostly Christmas is a retelling of the classic Christmas tale of Ebenezer Scrooge, and his visit from the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. It's a very intriguing plot, and one that's translated surprisingly well. Diesel takes the role of Ebenezer Scrooge, and he's pretty perfect for the role. The only character who I think would fit better would probably be Duncan, but he already had a Christmas episode of Duncan the Humbug. In Part 1, we get the setup, showing Diesel as being a very unhelpful engine, and so Thomas, Emily, Salty, and Paxton devise a plan to teach Diesel a lesson. Salty represents the ghost of Christmas past, and we see some really cool flashbacks from Diesel Does It Again and No More Mr. Nice Engine. Flashbacks are always cool to see, and fit the context of the ghost of Christmas past very well. My one criticism of the episode, and ultimately why I placed it lower than Part 2, is that it feels somewhat unevenly paced, and that all the exciting bits, the whole climax, happens in Part 2. I get why it's paced this way, to have Emily and Salty in Part 1, and Thomas and Paxton represent the other 2 ghosts in Part 2. 16. Diesel's Ghostly Christmas Part 2. So in Part 2, Diesel is visited by the ghost of Christmas present and the ghost of Christmas future. The ghost of Christmas present reminds Diesel of the bad deeds he did in Part 1, and the ghost of Christmas future tells Diesel that if he keeps his bad behavior up, no one will care for him, and he will be abandoned over time. Now here's an interesting thing that I only noticed on my latest rewatch. Did you notice that as Diesel is rotting away, being abandoned, his eyebrows get thinner, symbolizing that he gets older? That's a really cool detail. The reason why I put the second part of Diesel's Ghostly Christmas above Part 1 is because of Diesel's crash, after which Thomas gives him a taste of his own medicine, and Diesel's resolution, which is handled pretty well. Now perhaps his resolution was a little too abrupt, but I think it works well enough within the context of the episode. Either way, I think the scenes in Part 2 are overall more exciting than in Part 1, which is why I ultimately put Part 2 higher. 15. Confused Coaches. Confused Coaches is the last episode of Season 21 in release order, and what a way to go out! Despite its simple plot, Confused Coaches stands out in several ways. This was the episode to end Gordon and Spencer's 14-year-long rivalry, and the best thing is that it ends for good. Spencer only appears once after this episode, and although I would have liked to see him more, I'm glad that they stuck to this episode's conclusion. The way numbers are used in this episode is also well done, much better than Philip's number in my opinion. The bantering with the engine numbers and station platforms was fun as well. The whole sequence where Gordon and Spencer race, only for him to realize that Spencer has his passengers, is also well done. The music is great, like seriously, it has some great music. This episode might have some of my favorite music of all of CGI.
I'll show you who's the better engine, Spencer! We both know who that is, don't we?
And although they're a bit cartoony, the human scenes are fun as well. And lastly, this makes for a great New Year's episode. I think this is the only New Year's episode that we've had within the entirety of Thomas. The ending with the fireworks is simply amazing. 14. Duck and the Slip Coaches. Now you've heard me say this before, but I like episodes that involve real-life railway concepts, and that's why Duck and the Slip Coaches is so high on my list. Not only is it an episode about Duck, but the slip coaches are included as well, coaches that were actually used on the Great Western Railway. Not only that, but they are actually characters with faces. I wouldn't have expected that. I'd have thought that they'd be faceless. It's only a shame that they don't get names. Like Duck in the Water, James is a more prominent character here than Duck. However, Duck I think is better incorporated in this episode. He's the one to tell everyone about the slip coaches, and he's the one to call out James for his plagiarism. Plus, say whatever you want about it, but I like that scene where Duck takes Emily's spot in the shed. They knew what they were doing with that one. As a person who strongly prefers Duck and the Steam Team over Emily, that scene was quite the treat. 13. Henry's Hero. No, I didn't put this episode so high just because Duck returned in it. It's genuinely a great episode, featuring two well-developed characters. Going through all these episodes made me realize that Henry was treated really well in Season 17, and this episode is a prime example of that. The plot of this episode is about Henry and Hiro getting some bad coal, and when they realize it, Henry decides to wait for a new coal while Hiro continues on. Henry eventually is swayed by Hiro's determinism, however that comes back to bite Hiro when he breaks down on Gordon's Hill. Luckily, Henry is there to push him and the train to the end. What a triumphant climax! The whole scene is amazing, especially the music. I like Henry's redemption a lot, and it really highlights the contrasting dynamic between the two engines. Henry pushing Hiro over the hill is one of the most climactic moments of the whole season. You know, now that I think about it, in some ways, this episode is similar to Super Rescue. 12. Not So Slow Coaches. On the surface, this may seem like a regular Thomas episode, but I put it this high up for a couple of reasons. The main reason is that this episode actually portrays the relationship between Thomas, Annie, and Clarabelle. Sure, they have dialogue in other episodes, such as Thomas and the Emergency Cable or Thomas's Shortcut, but those episodes have a different main focus, whereas this one delves completely into their relationship. I love the chase scene and how desperate Thomas is to catch up with Caitlin, and when she passes the Vickerstown Bridge to the mainland, there is a brief moment where Thomas actually thinks that he might not see Annie and Clarabelle ever again. He is left with the consequence that he might just have lost two of his lifelong friends, and you can tell just how devastated he is by that. And that makes the resolution of this episode stick that much more. This isn't like one of those Diesel episodes where he just becomes nice at the end but resets next episode. No, here Thomas actually feels like he means it when he apologizes to Annie and Clarabelle because he almost lost them, and that their bond will improve. And it actually does. 11. Over the Hill. What a way to end off Season 20, in release order at least. Over the Hill develops the Ulfsted duo into an Ulfsted trio with the addition of Glyn. Although we saw him in the Christmas coffee pot, we get to know him more in this episode, especially with his dynamic with Steven. Dare I say it, the dynamic between the two might be one of the best character dynamics in the show, period. We get to see a bit of a new side to Steven. I would say that he's a bit out of character, but I can understand his jealousy towards Glyn as he feels threatened. There's a new antique in town now. But after a race, the two go from rivals to old friends. The scene is executed brilliantly, with the Eye of the Tiger piece bringing in a lot of tension, only for it to be subverted by Steven and Glyn's absurdly low speed. The way the two talk to the other engines is great too.
Show some respect for your elders!
I was winning races before you were even a sketch on a drawing board, young Gordon!
Oh, good one, Stephen. Would you like a cup of tea with that, young Gordon?
They're like old granddads, and I so wish we got to see more of this. The characters of Steven and Glyn alone carry the episode. 10. The Thomas Way. Can you tell I like Duck? Okay, there's a reason this one's so high. Actually, I'll admit it, my Duck bias won me over on this one. Look, let me have this one episode, okay? Anyway, starting off my top 10 is the Thomas Way. The reason I like it is because of the trio of Thomas, Duck, and Harold. Although all three have been around since Season 2, they haven't had an episode together until now, with All at Sea being the closest one I can think of. Duck feels relatively in character, and it makes sense to see him be stubborn compared to Thomas because he's proper about doing his job. I also like the moral at the end, when Duck realizes that there may just be more than two ways of doing things. I like that because it means that sometimes there's more to a situation than just black and white. I also really enjoyed the scene at Knapford Station when Gordon almost crashes into Thomas and Duck.
Thomas?
Oh,
Their reactions are all golden. 9. Unscheduled stops. This is the perfect Thomas's Branchline episode. It has it all. There's a real-life railway problem, when Birdie's passengers request Thomas to take extra stops. Thomas is perfectly in character here. Although he tries to follow the timetable, he also just can't resist dropping and picking up passengers at the extra stops. Annie and Clarabelle are great here as always. Topham's antics are actually quite entertaining, if a bit silly. There's no bouncing whatsoever despite this being one of the later season 21 episodes, and to add a cherry on top of the cake, Bolchi makes his grand return in CGI in this episode. For the 30 seconds he appears, he's pretty great. There really isn't anything I can fault Unscheduled Stops for. It's just one of the best episodes in terms of plot and execution. It highlights just how far Thomas as a character and as a franchise has come over the course of the past 5 seasons. 8. Bill or Ben. This is my favorite Bill and Ben episode of the Brenner era, and one of the few Bill and Ben episodes that doesn't feature Timothy. That's probably for the better. This episode features Bill and Ben with one of their most clever tricks to date, tricking Connor into believing that Bill is faster than him. I like when Bill and Ben play clever tricks like that. Not to mention their dialogue with Connor is very well done. But perhaps my favorite part is the ending, when Topham sends one of the twins to be repainted, to put a stop to their tricks once and for all, only for them to twist that punishment in their favor by both getting repainted. It's top tier Bill and Ben character, and that's essentially why Bill or Ben is my favorite episode of season 17. 7. All in Vain. The fact that James and Edward actually got an episode together just blows my mind. Before my recent watch through, I wasn't really sure what to think about this episode, but man, Edward and James are so strong here. James is not an obnoxious jerk. He's just trying to do his job while also staying clean, but of course nothing goes his way. I mentioned this with Pouty James, but James's facial expressions are great in this episode too. And Edward? Wow, he's better than I remembered. He's quite concerned and caring about James. His character is just spot on. And at the end, when he pulls a twist on the old "here's James" trope, that's just great.
Here's Edward!
I haven't mentioned this much throughout, but the animation here is amazing. The last few season 20 episodes, this one included, weren't completed by the time Arc Productions went bankrupt, and so Jamfield had to, well, fill in. I don't know if it's because of that or because of something else, but these episodes feel much more dynamic and exaggerated, such as that shot when James realizes his paintwork has been ruined by the leaves and twigs. I really like this style, and that, among other reasons, is probably why many of these episodes, including this one, ended up so high on this list. 6. Cautious Connor. Like All in Vain, Cautious Connor is executed so well that it deserves its place here up amongst the best of the best. Connor hasn't had too much spotlight prior to this episode, so I'm very glad that he got some elaboration on his character here. The plot of the episode is a good one. When Connor ends up in a mess, he decides to be more cautious in future, a little too cautious for his own good. The moral is great, but my favorite part of the episode is the humor. There are many visual gags throughout, such as Skiff being faster than Cautious Connor. And the ending, with Steven giving a pep talk to Connor and challenging him to a race, is amazingly well done. Steven is always a great character, but he especially shines in this episode. The music really hypes up the scene to a ridiculous degree, but it's all very fun. The visuals and humor really bring this episode to the next level. 5. Goodbye Fat Controller. Goodbye Fat Controller is a great episode concept, executed flawlessly. Considering how Topham seems to be just immortal in the TV series and has been on the railway forever, it makes sense that at some point the engines would suspect that he might retire at some point. What I love in particular about this episode is its execution. It's just so hilarious. There are plenty of visual gags in the episode, such as the engines all being super eager to please Sir Topham Hatt, which takes him off guard. Not to mention the music. The Sir Topham Hatt ditty from the classic seasons of Thomas plays several times here.
The Fat Controller worked in his temporary office.
And there's also a sequence featuring an instrumental version of the Sir Topham Hatt song from the Miller era. Now that's something I did not know I needed. There's also some funny and clever dialogue bits, especially with the confusion and delay moniker.
Sorry, sir.
I'm trying very hard not to be confusing or delayed.
And the meta nod to the fact that the engines basically cause accidents like every episode is pretty funny.
One way or another, we're always causing confusion and delay.
Everyone in the fandom has joked about that, so it's cool to see an actual episode acknowledge that as well. Overall, from the visual gags to the dialogue to the music to the meta references, this episode is simply hilarious. One of the funniest in the whole Brenner era. 4. Duncan and the Grumpy Passenger. Like with Duncan the Humbug, seeing a full-on Skarloey Railway episode with Duncan in it is great. We get to see the sights of the Skarloey Railway in very few episodes in CGI, but this is one of them. Like in Duncan the Humbug, the shots in this episode are some of the prettiest in the entire CGI series. But what puts this episode above the other Duncan one is the story. It's just so entertaining watching Duncan facing off against someone who complains even more than he does. I quite sympathize with Duncan here. After all, he's just trying to make a passenger happy, but he never manages to. This episode teaches a good lesson, which is that sometimes, no matter what, you can't make someone happy, so it's not worth the trouble. It's a moral that hasn't really been done before in the show, to my memory, which definitely makes this episode more original. Of course, I also gotta give props to the Grumpy Passenger. He's a very entertaining character to watch, and I'm glad that he appeared more beyond this one episode. The CGI series did a great job with fleshing out its human cast, and this episode is a prime example of that. So, if you've been following along and keeping track, you'll know which 3 episodes are left. And yeah, it may seem like an obvious pick to put these 3 at the top, but I just couldn't help it. I had to. It was a no-brainer. I even considered whether it'd be fair to put them on this list at all, but they are episodes within the Brenner era, so they're fair game. So, without further ado... Number 3. Useful Railway. If you know me, you probably saw this coming from a mile away. I just love the Arsdale episodes. It blows my mind to this day that not only did we get Railway series exclusive characters in CGI for the first time in 2015, but that they also got their own episodes, which are Railway series adaptations straight from the books for the first time since season 4, 20 years ago. That's just amazing. And seeing these stories told on screen at last, after years of only seeing them through words and pictures, it really was something to witness. These episodes have been translated on screen very well, with additional scenes and dialogues to spice up the story and to bring the episode to an 8-minute 45-second runtime. The scenery feels transcribed straight from the book, and they added some really cool details that I did not expect. Details which I didn't even think the model series would have done. Useful Railway is a good example of this. Like, it features Willie the farmer, just like in the original story. They didn't have to do that, but I'll always appreciate the fact that they did. The music is amazing as well, it's such a bop. So you're probably wondering, after all the stuff that I've just said, why is Useful Railway my least favorite of the Arsdale episodes? Well, it comes down to personal preference really. It's a lot of little things that put this episode a bit lower for me. I don't think the story is as interesting as Mike's Whistle or Tit for Tat. The crash is a little dragged out because of the slow motion bit, and this is really the only episode out of the 3 that Thomas feels shoehorned in. But make no doubt about it, I love this episode and I think it's a great finale to the Arsdale saga. Number 2. Mike's Whistle. Mike's Whistle is perhaps the most memorable episode of the Arsdale trilogy, even if it's not my favorite. But thanks to the character of Mike, it's a very entertaining story. He's just so hot-headed. I will admit I had my doubts when I found out that Tim Whitnall was voicing him. No offense to him, but he has like the softest voice ever. But I was pleasantly surprised to find just how much emotion he put into Mike's voice. At times he sounds so exasperated, such as when Rex is talking about whistles.
What? Whistles are very important, Rex. Engines without whistles aren't proper engines at all.
Or when he tries to shoo away the cow.
Shoo, shoo, shoo! Go on!
And of course, the passengers trying to whistle for Mike is hilarious, since they make such a racket. I also have to mention Mike's theme here. It fits his hot-tempered character very well. Lastly, it's nice to see Duck reprise his original role, even if that means Thomas is farting. Thanks, Thomas. Number 1. Tit for Tat. And here it is, my favorite episode of the Brenner era. There are plenty of reasons that I like this episode. First of all, Bert is my favorite miniature engine. I'm not really sure why, whether it's because he's blue, or because he's the oldest, or because he has the best story, but it's a personal bias that has accumulated over time. I'll tell you, out of all the Arsdale railway engines, I was most excited to see him in CGI. This episode is memorable for a multitude of other reasons. Of course, I have to mention the thin and fat clergymen, representations of the Reverend Audrey and Reverend Teddy Boston respectively, right from the original book. The fact that they were modeled in CGI at all is just astounding to me. They are the standout to me because they make the story so meta, with the fact that they come to photograph the Arsdale engines for the new book, which in reality is small railway engines. The episode even adds an extra nod at the end, where it hints that the Arsdale engines may appear on TV someday, which they of course did. That's such a clever touch, especially since this is the first Railway series adaptation since season 4. Seeing the small controller in CGI was really cool, and he even was referred to by name. One thing I'd like to mention here that applies to all 3 of the Arsdale episodes that I haven't really seen people talk about is the use of the drivers. In most CGI episodes, the drivers are just total NPCs who say or do nothing. So it's really cool to see the relationship with their engines in these 3 episodes. Of course, this is a product of Audrey's writing, but it's great to see it faithfully brought to these adaptations. It really makes a difference, I'd say. But overall, the main reason why Tit for Tat is my favorite episode of the Brenner era is because it really just shows the best of the era in terms of story, animation, music, and is ultimately a love letter to older fans like myself. So, that's that. I finally discussed and ranked all 124 episodes of the Brenner era. Do you agree with my thoughts? What's your favorite episode of the Brenner era? What's your least favorite? Let me know in the comments. This video took a long time to make, so if you stuck through to the end, thank you very much. If you enjoyed it, do consider subscribing. Now, you might be wondering whether I'll be making more YouTube videos in the future, and to be honest, I don't know myself. I have many ideas, but not as much motivation to get them done. I probably will be making more videos in the future, though not of this magnitude. They'd be a lot shorter. Well, that's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this video, and take care.